was the diesel engine. Mavis was a diesel engine who worked at the quarry. She shunted freight trucks for other engines to pick up. Mavis was a young engine, and she liked to get her own way. She thought she knew better than everyone else. Every day, Mavis would put Toby's trucks in a different place, so he had to search for them. "Trucks should be where I can find them," said Toby crossly. "Nonsense," said Mavis. "I can't waste time arguing," said Toby. "If you know so much, then take the trucks yourself." Mavis was very pleased. Taking trucks on Toby's branch line made her feel important. So, the next day, Mavis set off along the branch line with Toby's cars. But the cars didn't like Bossy Mavis.
"It's frosty today, let's play a trick on her,"
they whispered. Mavis travelled happily along Toby's line. Ahead of her was a railway crossing, so she stopped carefully. "I'm so good at this, I don't need silly old Toby," she laughed. But she didn't know what the trucks were planning. When it was time to move again, the trucks whispered to each other,
"Hold back, hold back."
Mavis tried to set off, but her wheels just spun. She couldn't get a grip on the frosty ground. The troublesome trucks giggled and giggled. The drivers of the cars and lorries waiting at the railway crossing were getting very angry. But there was nothing Mavis could do. Then Mavis saw Toby approaching in the distance. He had come to help. "Having trouble, Mavis?" he smiled. Mavis felt cross and silly. She had boasted to Toby that she knew best, and now she was stuck and Toby had to rescue her. Toby was coupled to Mavis. He puffed and slipped, and at last he got Mavis and the trucks moving. Mavis hardly helped at all. She didn't even say thank you. When Mavis got back to the quarry, the fat controller was very annoyed with her. "You are a naughty engine," he said. "You will stay here from now on." Mavis felt angry. She thought the quarry was boring. She wished she could go on Toby's branch line again. Soon spring arrived on Sodor. It was a very busy time at the quarry. Every day Mavis got the trucks ready for Toby, but she was never allowed to take them along Toby's branch line. Then one day, Mavis had an idea. She said to the trucks, "When we get to the beginning of Toby's line, will you please bump me? Then I'll be on his line whether he likes it or not." "Oh, yes, yes, yes," giggled the freight trucks. "I'll show that fuss budget, Toby," said Mavis to herself. But when the time came, Mavis was busy somewhere else. So Toby shunted the trucks himself.
"Never mind,"
the trucks whispered to each other.
"let's bump Toby instead."
So they gave Toby a big bump. He rushed onto his branch line much too fast. His driver and fireman were knocked over. Toby was out of control. Toby couldn't stop. He rushed over the railway crossing. Luckily, there weren't any trucks there. Up ahead, there was an old bridge. The river had flooded, and part of the bridge had been washed away. If Toby didn't stop before he reached it, he might fall in the river. As Toby approached the bridge, the rails stretched across the gap, just like a tightrope. His driver braked hard. but Toby slid along the track. His brakes squealed. He used every bit of his strength and stopped just in time. Mavis felt terrible. It was all her fault. So she rushed to the rescue. First, she pulled the trucks back up the track. Then, she helped pull Toby carefully away from the bridge. "I'm sorry, Toby," she said. "It's all my fault." "Never mind, Mavis," said Toby kindly. "Thank you for rescuing me." After that day, Mavis and Toby became good friends. Mavis still bossed the trucks around at the quarry, but she always listened to Toby's advice. And sometimes, as a special treat, Toby would let Mavis take the freight trucks carefully along his branch line. Emily the Stirling engine. A new engine was arriving on the Island of Sodor. Thomas puffed happily into Knapford Station. At the platform there was a beautiful engine with shiny paintwork and gleaming brass fittings. "Thomas, meet Emily," said the Fat Controller. "Hello," wheezed Thomas. "Hello," puffed Emily. "Emily, go and pick up the coaches so you can learn the passenger routes," said the Fat Controller. "Yes, sir," smiled Emily, and she steamed away. The only coaches Emily could find were Annie and Clarabel. Her driver hooked them up and Emily puffed slowly and carefully along the track. Annie and Clarabel grumbled all the way. "There'll be trouble when Thomas finds out," whispered Clarabel. But Emily couldn't understand why the coaches were so cross. She passed Edward and Percy and whistled a friendly hello, but the engines just stared angrily at her. Emily was pleased to see Thomas puffing down the line. "Hello, Thomas," she called cheerfully. But Thomas glared at Emily when he saw she was pulling Annie and Clarabel. "Those are my coaches," he muttered crossly. Now Thomas was being rude, and Emily had no idea why. She chuffed away feeling very sad. Thomas was at Maithwaite Station when the Fat Controller arrived. "I want you to go to the docks to pick up some new coaches," he ordered. "New coaches?" exclaimed Thomas. "But, sir—" "Really useful engines don't argue," shouted the Fat Controller. Thomas was very unhappy. He thought the new coaches were for him, and he wanted Annie and Clarabel back. Later that day, Emily returned to the yard. Oliver was very surprised to see her pulling Annie and Clarabel. "Those are Thomas's coaches," he cried. "No wonder he was cross," said Emily. "I will return them right away." Meanwhile, Thomas was puffing angrily along the track with the new coaches. "Don't want new coaches," he chuffed. Emily was on her way back when a signalman waved her down. Oliver hadn't cleared his box. Emily sped off to see what was wrong. Oliver had broken down on the track crossing and his driver had gone for help. Suddenly, Emily heard a whistle in the distance. Thomas was steaming along the track, straight into Oliver. He would never be able to stop in time. Emily quickly charged toward Oliver and pushed him off the track, just before Thomas rocketed past. Emily had saved Thomas and Oliver. That evening, the Fat Controller had a special surprise for her. "Emily, you were a very brave engine," he said. So it gives me great pleasure to present you with 2 brand new coaches. Thank you, sir, replied Emily. Thomas, I'm sorry I took Annie and Clarabel. And I'm sorry I was so cross, said Thomas. Emily was very happy. She had 2 beautiful new coaches and a new friend. Later that summer, the Fat Controller opened some new routes. Emily was given the flour mill special. I have to do the Black Lock run, huffed James. He's frightened of the Black Lock monster, teased Thomas. Nonsense, said James, and he puffed away. What's the Black Lock monster? Asked Emily. Nobody knows, said Thomas. Black shapes move in the water, then disappear. Emily was glad she didn't have to go to Black Lock. The next morning, Emily collected the trucks from the flour mill. But they were being naughty. Emily pulled as hard as she could, but the trucks made her go very slowly. Emily was late delivering the flour, so there was no fresh bread that day. The Fat Controller was cross. I didn't have any toast for breakfast. If you are late again, you will have to do the Black Lock run instead of James. I must get the flour to the bakery on time tomorrow, puffed Emily. But the next day, the trucks were being naughty again. They told Emily to leave before they were coupled properly, so half of them were left behind. The bakery manager was very angry when Emily arrived with only half the flour. Emily raced back to the mill for the rest of the trucks. She was very cross and shunted them with all her strength. But the trucks had taken their brakes off. They rolled backward and splashed into the duck pond. Emily was covered in a gluey, floury mess. That evening, the Fat Controller came to see her. Emily, you are going to take over the Black Lock run, he shouted. It might be nice, said Thomas reassuringly, but Emily wasn't so sure. The next morning, she puffed sadly to the station. There were lots of excited children and vacationers waiting for her. I mustn't let them down, she thought, and soon Emily was steaming up hills and through valleys. Finally, Emily reached the murky waters of Black Lock. Suddenly, she saw something move in the water. Her boiler quivered and her valves rattled. Then the water settled, and Emily saw what the monster really was. It's a family of seals, she cried in delight. That evening, Emily took Thomas to watch the seals. Black Lock is a nice route after all, said Emily. Well, things aren't always what they seem, said Thomas cheerfully, and both engines smiled. Jeremy the Jet Plane. Thomas the Tank Engine loves having buffers that bump and a boiler that bubbles. He loves having wheels that whiz round and round and a whistle that he can peep. But most of all, Thomas loves working on the Fat Controller's rail. It was the day of the Sodor summer picnic. The Fat Controller came with news of a special job for Thomas. You are to pick up the children from the airport and take them to the picnic, he boomed cheerfully. Thomas was excited. Yes, sir, he whistled and set off at once. The airport was new, and all the engines wanted to go there. Thomas had just arrived when he heard a loud noise in the sky. Whoosh! A jet plane was coming into land. Thomas chuffed over to the big hangar. "Hello," he peeped. "I'm Thomas, and I'm a tank engine." "Hello," said the plane. "I'm Jeremy, and I'm a jet plane. Flying is the most fun in the world. I can see the whole island at once," he said. Thomas thought Jeremy was being boastful. "Well, I like travelling on tracks," he huffed. Thomas puffed sadly away. "I never want to talk to a jet plane again," he grumbled. He cheered up, though, when he saw the children waiting on the platform. The Fat Controller and Lady Hat were there too, with a large picnic basket full of delicious things to eat. The guard loaded the hamper into Clarabel. Thomas set off for the picnic, but soon had to stop at a signal. He heard Jeremy taking off. Whoosh! Then Jeremy flew right over his funnel. "It's not fair," puffed Thomas. "Jet planes don't have to stop at signals." At the picnic, everyone was soon having a jolly time. Everyone except Thomas. Percy saw that he looked sad. "What's wrong, Thomas?" he asked. "Jet planes can go wherever they like. I wish I were a jet plane," chuffed Thomas. "But engines can pull coaches and take children to picnics," peeked Percy. "Engines are really useful." Thomas wasn't so sure. Jeremy was jetting to the mainland, but dark rain clouds were gathering. Jeremy had to return to the airport. Thomas was passing as Jeremy came into land. Thomas didn't want to talk to him. "Thomas!" Jeremy called out. "A summer storm is on its way. The picnic will be ruined." "Cinders and ashes," gasped Thomas. "I must tell the Fat Controller." Thomas steamed through tunnels and whizzed around bends. He reached the picnic just as the first drops of rain began to fall. "Quickly!" he whooshed. "A big storm is coming! The picnic will be washed away!" Everyone helped pack up the picnic basket and boarded Annie and Clarabel. The children were sad that the picnic was over. Then Thomas had an idea. He steamed to the airport as fast as his wheels would carry him. Jeremy was inside, keeping nice and dry in his big hangar. "Can the children please have their picnic here in your hangar?" asked Thomas. "Of course," said Jeremy. "What a splendid idea!" Thomas was very happy. Soon all the children were feeling jolly again, and so was the Fat Controller. "Well done, Thomas and Jeremy," he boomed. "Together you have saved the picnic. You are both really useful." Jeremy was happy to have helped, and Thomas had never felt prouder to be a tank engine. Now, whenever Thomas sees Jeremy flying high above him in the sky, he always whistles, "Beep, beep!" And Jeremy likes nothing better than looking out for Thomas, steaming along his branch line on the Island of Sodor. Blue Mountain Mystery. It was a busy day at the Blue Mountain Quarry. Rusty shunted trucks of slate. Owen lifted equipment up and down the rocky walls. The narrow-gauge quarry engines were smaller and lighter than the other engines. They had special tracks. Paxton, a visiting diesel, was impressed by how hard they all worked. Suddenly, there was a loud noise. Giant stones were falling from Blondin Bridge. Rheneas tried to stop, but his heavy trucks pushed him toward the bridge. Rheneas rolled across the bridge just in time. Unfortunately, Paxton was buried under some fallen stones. He was all right, but he needed repairs. Thomas went to the quarry to work in Paxton's place. "I like working with my narrow-gauge friends," he whistled. Suddenly, a small green engine darted out of a tunnel. "Hello," peeped Thomas. But the little green engine rolled away into another tunnel. Thomas asked Skarloey about the green engine. "His name is Luke. He hides here because he did something very bad." Thomas promised to keep the secret locked in his funnel. What did Luke do that was so bad? Thomas wondered aloud later that night. "Don't worry, Luke, I'll find a way to help you." But Thomas wasn't really alone. Someone was listening. The next morning, as Thomas chucked to work, Luke emerged from a tunnel. "Hi, Thomas," Luke said. "I'm sorry I hid from you. Will you be my friend?" "I'd like that," replied Thomas. Thomas and Luke worked together at the boulder drop all day. "Why do you keep hiding?" Thomas asked Luke. They didn't notice that Paxton was back. He was listening to Luke's story. "I first came to the Island of Sodor on a boat," said Luke. "When they were lifting me off it, I bumped into a little yellow engine and sent him splashing into the sea." Paxton couldn't believe what he had heard. He raced off to tell Diesel. Later, Thomas heard Paxton telling Diesel the story. "The yellow engine was never seen again," said Diesel. "We have to tell the Fat Controller at Mr. Percival." Thomas was worried. He had to find out what happened to the little yellow engine. Thomas chuffed to the steamworks to ask Victor if he knew anything. "That was me," said Victor. Victor's story about his trip to the Island of Sodor was the same as Luke's, except for one important detail. "My chains were broken," Victor said. "That's why I fell into the sea. But Cranky fished me out." "So it was an accident," peeped Thomas, "and you were repaired." "Yes," replied Victor. "I chose to be painted a new color, red." "I'm glad I found you," Thomas said. "Luke needs your help." Diesel tracked down Luke at the quarry. Luke rolled up the narrow gauge tracks to get away. Diesel couldn't follow. "You can't hide," shouted Diesel. "The Fat Controller is going to kick you off Sodor. Thomas can't save you now." "Yes, I can," peeped Thomas. The quarry walls were high, so Thomas needed Owen's help. Thomas was heavy. Owen lifted him all the way to the top. But Thomas's wheels were too big for the narrow gauge tracks. They skidded off the rails, and Thomas rolled toward a cliff. Just then, Luke came round a bend. "Watch out, Thomas!" cried Diesel. "He's going to push you off, just like he did to that yellow engine." "Don't worry, Thomas," said Luke. "I'll get you back to Owen." Luke gently pulled Thomas back toward the platform. "You're doing it!" peeped Thomas. Luke felt strong. He pulled Thomas to Owen, but the two engines weighed too much. The platform began to drop straight down. Owen worked his hardest. Gears whined, sparks flew. He stopped the platform before it hit the ground. Thomas and Luke were safe. All the engines cheered, except for Diesel. Just then, the Fat Controller and Mr. Percival arrived. They were confused and angry. "Luke is a bad engine," said Diesel. "He pushed the yellow engine into the sea." Victor steamed into the quarry. Everyone was surprised. "Look, you didn't push me," Victor said. "It was an accident. I was repaired and painted red." For the first time in a long, long time, Luke was truly happy. The Fat Controller was upset with Diesel. "You didn't find out the whole story," he said. "What really happened is what really matters." "Well done, Thomas," said the Fat Controller. "Today is a happy day for Mr. Percival and his engines." Thomas and all his friends, new and old, whistled happily. On Misty Island. One day, Thomas and Edward had a special job. The mayor needed them to fetch Joby wood from Misty Island. "You'll need our help," Bash and Dash told Thomas. "The log loaders can be very naughty." "That's right," added Ferdinand. But Thomas had been to Misty Island before, and he thought he knew all about it. He didn't need their help. Thomas showed Edward around the island. Then he led the way to the Shake Shake Bridge. The logging station was just on the other side. As they crossed the bridge, it wibbled and wobbled under their wheels. Edward was scared. He stopped halfway across and wouldn't budge. "Don't worry, Edward," said Thomas. "I'll fetch the logs. Then we can take them back to Sodor straight away." The naughty log loader, old Wheezy, picked up some Joby logs. But instead of putting them onto Thomas's truck, he whirled and hurled them up into the air. The logs flew everywhere. "Blistering boilers!" cried Edward. The logs flew towards him, bounced off his cab, and made the Shake Shake Bridge shake even more. He was more scared than ever. As old Wheezy threw more logs around, Bash, Dash and Ferdinand puffed in. "It looks like you need our help now," said Bash and Dash. "That's right," said Ferdinand as usual. But Thomas still thought he didn't need help, so they rolled away again. Thomas chuffed over to Hiro, the other log loader. but Hiro was feeling too ill to work. Just then, James arrived with the Fat Controller. Hiro wheezed and wheezed, and then coughed black smoke all over them. "Thomas," boomed the Fat Controller crossly, "logs are flying everywhere. Edward won't move and you are late with your delivery." Thomas felt terrible. "I'm sorry, sir. I thought I didn't need help, but I was wrong," he peeped. "Now I'll make things right." Thomas found Bash, Dash and Ferdinand. "I can't do this alone," he puffed. "I need your help." "Do as we say and we'll show you the way," chuffed Bash and Dash. "That's right," said Ferdinand. Together they steamed back to the logging station. First, the 3 locomotives pushed Edward across the Shake Shake Bridge. Next, they oiled Hiro's joints to make him feel better. Then they caught all the logs that old Wheezy threw in the air. Soon all the trucks were piled high with Joby wood. When the 5 engines delivered the wood, the Fat Controller said, "You are all really useful engines." "We make a great team," whistled Bash and Dash. Then all together, Ferdinand, Thomas and Edward peeped, "That's right!" Fire Engine Flynn. Flynn, the red fire engine, was at the Sodor Rescue Centre. Diesel pulled up beside him. "Good morning," said Flynn. "It isn't a good morning," moaned Diesel. "I'm very busy." "You're not busy." "I am waiting to get busy," said Flynn. He always wanted to be really useful. Just then the rescue bell rang. "Ring-a-ling! Stand by, Fire Engine Flynn," boomed Rocky. "There's a blue engine—" Flynn didn't wait to hear any more. He sounded his siren loudly. "Wah! I'm ready to save the blue engine," he called, and with a honk of his horn, he was off in a flash. "There's a blue engine in trouble," puffed Flynn as he raced down the track. When he saw Edward, the blue engine, he screeched to a stop. "Edward, I've come to save you," he called. "Fire Engine Flynn to the rescue." Flynn fired his water cannons. Water whooshed all over Edward. And Edward's driver too. "Flynn, what are you doing?" Edward cried out. "I'm not on fire." "Oh, I'm sorry, Edward," Flynn said. He felt very silly. "It must be another blue engine that's in trouble," said Flynn. "I must hurry to find it." And Flynn rushed away. Gordon was at Marron Station. He was picking up the Fat Controller and Lady Hat. When Flynn saw Gordon, the blue engine, he screeched to a stop. "Gordon, I've come to save you," he cried. "Fire Engine Flynn to the rescue." Flynn fired his water cannons. Water splashed all over Gordon and the Fat Controller. "I'm not on fire, Flynn," Gordon grumbled. Flynn had tried to save the wrong engine again. He felt very silly indeed. "I'm sorry," said Flynn. "It must be another blue engine that's in trouble. I have to find it." And Flynn whizzed away. "I wish I'd waited to hear which engine needed help," said Flynn sadly. Flynn found another blue engine at the diesel works. It was Thomas. His firebox was on fire. Flynn fired his water cannons. But no water came out. Flynn had used it all up. "Sorry, Thomas," Flynn said sadly. "I didn't wait to hear which blue engine I had to save, and now I can't save you." Then Flynn had a great idea. "Diesels," he said, "you will save Thomas." So the Diesel's drivers poured water on Thomas's flaming firebox, and with a fizz, the fire went out. Flynn trundled back to the rescue centre, where he was filled up with water. He waited to be busy once more. The rescue bell rang again. "An engine needs help," boomed Rocky. And this time, Flynn waited to hear which engine it was. The Lost Pup. One day, the Fat Controller told the engines about some damaged track at Knapford Bend. All the engines listened carefully, except Paxton and Thomas, who were laughing at a duck. "May I remind you two in particular not to be silly," the Fat Controller told them. "I don't want any accidents." Later, Paxton arrived at the broken track. As he rolled over it, it rattled his radiator, making him laugh. "That was fun," he grinned. And when Thomas appeared, Paxton got him to try it too. "Woo-hoo-hoo-hoo!" Thomas giggled as he bounced along. "Get a good run-up and go really fast over it," Paxton suggested. So Thomas raced backwards around the corner and bashed into Toby, who was filling up at the water tower. Water sploshed all over Thomas, which put out his firebox. "Oh no, the Fat Controller told me not to be silly. But I was, and now there's been an accident," Paxton said. He rolled quietly away to deliver his trucks to the shunting yard. When Toby arrived, Paxton heard him tell Stafford that Thomas had lost his puff. That sounded serious. Paxton decided to find Thomas's lost puff. He raced along looking all around, but he didn't really know what to look for. Then he saw a puff of steam and raced after it. But it was just Gordon pulling the express. Next, Paxton spotted a fluffy cloud in the sky. "That must be Thomas's missing puff," he said, as he hurried towards it. Paxton followed the cloud all the way to Ulstead Castle, where he met Stephen. "Hello, Paxton," said Stephen. "What are you doing here?" "Thomas lost his puff, and I thought that might be it," Paxton told him. "Up there? That's just a cloud," Stephen replied. Paxton felt rather silly. He sped away as fast as his wheels could carry him. Paxton realised he didn't know about steam engine's puff because he's a diesel engine. But he knew someone who did know about steam engines. Victor, who repaired them. At the steamworks, Paxton asked Victor if he had any spare puff for Thomas, which made Toby laugh. "Puff just means steam," Toby told Paxton. "When Thomas bumped into me, his firebox got wet, and steamies can't make puff when their fire goes out." Yet again, Paxton felt silly. But he cheered up when he realised that Thomas would be fine when his firebox dried out. As Paxton sped back to the water tower, he heard a peep, and Thomas puffed around the corner. "You're okay," Paxton said. "Yes, I found my puff," Thomas joked. "At least I learned something today," Paxton smiled. "That puff means steam?" asked Thomas. Yes, but also that when the Fat Controller tells me not to be silly, I shouldn't be silly, smiled Paxton. And Thomas agreed. Duck, the Great Western Engine. One morning, Percy was talking to Gordon and James in the engine shed.
The Fat Controller is getting a bigger engine to help me,
said Percy proudly. Nonsense, said Gordon. We don't need a bigger engine.
You just need to work more and chatter less, said James.
Percy sighed.
No one listens to me. They think I'm a silly little engine and order me around. I'll show them.
But he didn't know how. Later that day, Percy brought some coaches to the station. Hello, Percy, said the Fat Controller. You look tired.
Yes, sir,
replied Percy sadly.
I don't know if I'm standing on my dome or my wheels.
Cheer up, Percy, laughed the Fat Controller. The new engine can do the work here alone. You can help Thomas and Toby build my new harbour.
Oh, thank you, sir,
said Percy happily. The next morning, the new engine arrived. He was a Great Western engine. What's your name? asked the Fat Controller. Montague, sir, but everyone calls me Duck because they say I waddle, replied the engine. I don't really, sir, but I like being called Duck. Duck it is then, said the Fat Controller. Percy, come and show Duck around. Percy and Duck got on well. Duck knew how to make the trucks behave, and soon they were almost finished. James, Gordon and Henry watched Duck quietly doing his work. Let's have some fun, they whispered. And they wheezed. Quack, quack, quack. Percy was cross, but Duck ignored them. Then the engines began to order him around. Do they tell you to do things, Percy? asked Duck.
Yes, they do,
replied Percy sadly. Right, said Duck. We'll soon stop that nonsense. And he whispered something to Percy. We'll do it tonight. That evening, the Fat Controller was just about to go home for dinner when he heard a terrible noise. He hurried to the yard. Henry, Gordon and James were wheezing furiously. Stop that noise! Bellowed the Fat Controller. They won't let us in, hissed Gordon. The Fat Controller realised that Duck and Percy were sitting calmly at the points outside the engine shed, refusing to move. The Fat Controller was very angry. Duck, explain this behaviour, he shouted. Beg your pardon, sir, said Duck politely, but these engines are giving us orders. Can you please inform them that we only take orders from you? Duck and Percy, you are causing a disturbance, thundered the Fat Controller. And as for you, he said, turning to the big engines, you made the disturbance. Duck is quite right. This is my railway and I give the orders. Henry, Gordon and James were very embarrassed. From then on, Duck worked well at the yard, and the Fat Controller was very pleased with him. One day, Duck was resting in the engine shed when the Fat Controller arrived. Would you like to have a branch line of your own? He asked. Yes, please, sir, Duck replied excitedly. And he took charge of his own branch line, which ran along the coast to the small railway. Duck was very proud of his branch line, but he couldn't do all the work himself, so Donald and Douglas took turns helping him.
One evening he was talking to Donald. "You don't understand how much the Fat Controller relies on me," said Duck proudly. "I'm a Great Western and—" "Quack, quack, quack," interrupted Donald. "You sound like you laid an egg. Now let an engine sleep." "Quack yourself," said Duck indignantly. The following morning, Duck spoke to his driver. "Donald says I quack as if I laid an egg," he said. "Let's play a joke on him and teach him a lesson." "I have an idea," laughed his fireman, and he whispered something to Duck and his driver. That night, when Donald was asleep, Duck's driver and fireman put something into Donald's water tank. The next morning, when Donald stopped for water, he found an unexpected passenger aboard. A little duckling popped out of his water tank. His driver and fireman could hardly believe their eyes. But Donald smiled. "I know who's behind this," he laughed. And Donald told them what had happened in the shed. The duckling was tame. She shared the driver and fireman's sandwiches and rode in the tender. But as the day went on, she grew tired of travelling and hopped off at a station, where she stayed. Before they reached home, Donald and his driver and fireman made a plan. That night they were very busy, and when Duck's crew arrived in the morning, they made a surprise discovery. "Look, Duck," they laughed. "There's a nest with an egg in it under your bunker." Donald opened a sleepy eye. "Well, well," he exclaimed. "You must have laid there in the night." Duck laughed. "You win, Donald. It would take a clever engine to get the better of you." Duck and Donald became good friends, and the duckling settled down at the station. She lived in a pond nearby, but she always flew back to the station to welcome the engines. Donald was her favourite, and she sometimes hopped on for a ride. The station master called her Dilly, but to everyone else, she was always Donald's duck. The big surprise. Sodor Surprise Day was the day when friends surprised each other and made each other laugh. Thomas and Charlie were making each other giggle, but Gordon wasn't impressed. Sodor Surprise Day is a silly day for silly engines, he huffed. The Fat Controller arrived to tell them about a party that night at Callan Castle. He asked Thomas to collect the bunting from Maithwaite Station and Gordon to collect the fireworks from Brendam Docks. Thomas wanted to surprise Gordon, so he hurried ahead to the docks. On the way, Thomas stopped to talk to Rosie, who was pulling coal cars. When Gordon came down the track, Thomas blew his whistle loudly. Peep! Rosie jumped in surprise, bumping into her cars. Soot flew everywhere. But Gordon wasn't surprised. He just huffed away. Thomas raced ahead of Gordon again and hid in a siding where Whiff was shunting garbage cars. When Gordon steamed past, Thomas puffed out. Boo! Whiff jumped in surprise, bashing into his cars. Garbage flew everywhere. But Gordon still wasn't surprised. He just huffed away. Thomas dashed to arrive at the docks before Gordon, and he hid behind some trucks. When Gordon arrived, Cranky started to lift a crate of fireworks for him. "I'll make Gordon laugh this time," Thomas giggled. He whooshed out from behind the trucks with a loud toot. Cranky was very surprised. He dropped the crate of fireworks with a crash and a bang. The crate broke open and the fireworks set themselves off, fizzing and whizzing everywhere. But Gordon still wasn't surprised. Gordon was cross. "Your silly tricks didn't surprise me or make me laugh," Gordon said sternly to Thomas. "I told you Sodor Surprise Day was silly. Now I don't like it at all." The Fat Controller arrived looking very stern indeed. "Thomas, there are no more fireworks for the party," he said. "And you haven't picked up the bunting. We will have to cancel the party." Thomas felt terrible. His silly pranks had ruined everything. Then Thomas spotted Harold in the sky, and an idea flew into his funnel. "Please don't cancel the party, sir. I know how I can get Sodor Surprise Day back on track," he said. "Very well then," said the Fat Controller. Gordon set off to pick up the bunting, and Thomas headed to the washdown to get clean for the party. Whiff and Rosie were already there. Once Thomas was clean, he puffed off to find Harold. "Harold can help me save the day," thought Thomas. That night, Thomas steamed up to the party. Harold flew above him, decorated with fairy lights. It was a marvellous sight. Gordon beamed. "I do like Sodor Surprise Day after all," he laughed. And Thomas was so surprised, he thought his boiler might burst. Bubble Trouble. Mr. Bubbles' clown show was in town. Mr. Bubbles could blow the biggest bubbles anyone had ever seen. All the engines wheezed with excitement. Except Thomas. He had a broken funnel, and he felt glum. While Thomas's funnel was being mended, he had to wear a spare funnel, but it was big and red and very ugly. Thomas felt silly wearing the big red funnel. The Fat Controller had an important job for Thomas. He was to take Mr. Bubbles' special bubble mixture to Knapford Station for the show that night. "Go carefully, Thomas," warned the Fat Controller. "You mustn't spill any." The Fat Controller went in his car with Mr. Bubbles. They would meet Thomas at Knapford Station. Thomas huffed noisily and set off. He was grumpy because he didn't like his big red funnel. Soon Thomas came to a road crossing. Gordon was there too. "That's a funny funnel," laughed Gordon. Thomas huffed crossly and raced away. He forgot about being careful. The bubble mixture splashed and splashed onto the road. Right in front of the Fat Controller's car. The car skidded and skated on the bubble mixture and slid into a muddy ditch. "Slow down, Thomas!" shouted the Fat Controller, but Thomas didn't hear. Then Thomas came to a bridge. Henry was there too. "Oh, that's a funny funnel," hooted Henry. Thomas snorted loudly and sped on. The bubble mixture splashed and splashed onto the road below. right in front of the Fat Controller's car again. The car skidded and skated on the bubble mixture and slid into a pond. "My bubble mixture!" cried Mr. Bubbles, but Thomas hadn't noticed. When Thomas arrived at Knapford Station, the Fat Controller was very cross. Mr. Bubbles was sad. There was no bubble mixture left for the show. Thomas was sorry. "I'll fetch some more and I'll get back in time for the show," he promised. Thomas raced off to collect the new bubble mixture. However, this time he puffed as quickly but as carefully as he could. Just as the show began, Thomas chuffed into Knapford Station with the new bubble mixture. "Hooray!" cheered the children. With his funny funnel, they thought Thomas was part of the clown show. Mr. Bubbles laughed and blew an enormous bubble. Thomas tooted happily. He was pleased with his funny red funnel, after all. Annie and Clarabel were Thomas's coaches. Annie could only take passengers, but Clarabel could take passengers, luggage and the guard. The coaches were old and needed new paint, but Thomas loved them very much, and they loved him too. Thomas never got cross with Annie and Clarabel, but he did get cross with the other engines on the main line who made them late. One day, Thomas, Annie and Clarabel were waiting for Henry's train to arrive. Henry was late, and Thomas was getting more and more annoyed. "How can I run my train properly if Henry's always late? He doesn't realise that the Fat Controller depends on me," he said. "I'm sure he'll be along soon," replied Annie and Clarabel, looking around for Henry. At last, Henry's train arrived. Thomas was very cross with Henry, but Annie and Clarabel waited patiently as lots of passengers got out of Henry's train and climbed into them. Finally, the guard blew his whistle, and Thomas started at once. But as the guard turned to jump into Clarabel's van, he tripped over a woman's umbrella. By the time he had picked himself up, Thomas, Annie and Clarabel were steaming out of the station. The guard waved his red flag to stop them, but Thomas and his driver didn't see him. Come along, sang Thomas. "I've lost my nice guard," sobbed Clarabel. Annie tried to tell Thomas, "We've left the guard on the platform." But Thomas was too busy hurrying to listen. "Oh, come along," he puffed impatiently. Annie and Clarabel tried to pull Thomas back, but Thomas paid no attention. Thomas didn't stop till they came to a signal. "That silly signal! What's the matter?" Thomas asked his driver. "I don't know," replied the driver. "The guard will tell us in a minute." They waited and waited, but the guard didn't come. "Peep, peep, peep, peep! Where is the guard?" whistled Thomas. "We tried to tell you. We've left him behind," sobbed Annie and Clarabel. Thomas looked back along the line, and there was the guard, running as fast as he could. Everybody cheered, especially Annie and Clarabel. "I'm very sorry," said Thomas, when the guard reached them. "It wasn't your fault, Thomas. It was the woman's umbrella," said the guard, catching his breath.
the signal is down. Let's make up for lost time. Thomas set off at once, and Annie and Clarabel sang, as fast as you can, as fast as you can, all the way to the end of the line. A few days later, Thomas was ill, and the big station couldn't make him better. He would have to go to the works. Annie and Clarabel were sad. They would really miss Thomas. Duck came to the station to help while Thomas was away. He was very gentle with Annie and Clarabel, and they liked Duck very much. He is so calm and has such nice manners, they told each other. It really is a pleasure to go out with him. Annie and Clarabel were sorry to say goodbye to Duck when Thomas came home, but they were very pleased to have their old friend back. They told Thomas how well Duck had managed. Thomas was a bit jealous, but he was so pleased to be home that he soon forgot. The works had made Thomas feel much better, but they had left his handbrake very stiff. This made his brakes seem as if they were on when they weren't. Thomas's driver and fireman soon learned to be extra careful, so they didn't overshoot the platform. But one day, Thomas's fireman was ill, and a relief fireman took his place. Thomas, Annie and Clarabel were waiting for Henry's train to arrive. The fireman fastened the coupling, but he forgot all about Thomas's handbrake. Suddenly, Thomas felt his wheels begin to move. He tried to stop, but his driver and fireman were on the platform. Thomas, Annie and Clarabel gathered speed out of the station. "Stop! Stop!" shrieked Annie and Clarabel, but Thomas kept on going. The signalman sent a message along the line, and an inspector prepared to stop Thomas near the airfield. But Thomas was going much too fast for the inspector to act. Quickly, the inspector climbed aboard Harold, and they took off. Below, Thomas was getting tired. I need to stop, he panted wearily. Annie and Clarabel knew that they had to do something to help their friend. The coaches remembered how calm Duck was when they worked with him. They had to be just as calm and steady now. Annie and Clarabel pulled back as they went uphill and managed to slow poor Thomas down. As they neared the station, they saw Harold land and the inspector run toward the platform. This time, Thomas entered the station slowly enough for the inspector to jump into his cab and put the handbrake on hard. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief as the train stopped. That evening, the Fat Controller came to see Thomas, Annie and Clarabel. He told Thomas that he would have his handbrake repaired right away and congratulated Annie and Clarabel for helping Thomas when he really needed them. Annie and Clarabel were delighted, and Thomas beamed with pride. He always knew that they were the best coaches in the Fat Controller's railway. Rocky the Big Crane. Edward is a really useful engine. He has worked on the Fat Controller's railway for many years. One morning, he steamed into the docks to pick up some heavy pipes. Gordon and Thomas were already there, talking about a new crane called Rocky, who had just arrived on the island. He looks so strong, Thomas puffed excitedly. I'm sure he could lift even you up, Gordon. Gordon sniffed. That crane might be big, he said, but he has no engine. He can't move unless one of us pulls him. Edward looked at the crane and saw that Gordon was right. Then I don't think he can be really useful, chuffed Edward slowly.
Quite right, Edward,
Huffed Gordon.
he will only get in the way.
Just then, Percy arrived. He was very excited to see the new crane. He will only get in the way, puffed Edward.
Newfangled nonsense,
Gordon wished, and he chuffed off. Oh, what's a newfangled nuisance, Edward? Peeped Percy. Newfangled nonsense, Percy, puffed Edward, as grandly as he could. It's something that is new and not really useful. Edward's trucks were right beside the new crane. My name's Rocky, the crane smiled at Edward. I'm Edward, puffed the blue engine. Can I come with you? Asked Rocky. I could help you with those heavy pipes. I don't need your help, sniffed Edward. Newfangled nonsense. And he puffed off quickly, before the pipes had been properly tied down. Edward was approaching a signal. He was going too fast, but he was so busy thinking about Rocky that he didn't notice. Suddenly the signal changed to red. Edward screeched to a stop. He jolted his truck so much that their sides collapsed. Steel pipes toppled all over the tracks. Bust my buffers, puffed Edward. Edward looked at the heavy pipes and wondered if Rocky might help him lift them. Thomas had said the new crane was very strong. Newfangled nonsense, huffed Edward. He asked his driver to telephone for Harvey instead. Soon the crane steamed up and started moving the pipes. But they were so heavy that he could only lift them one by one. This is going to take me a very long time, poor Harvey gasped. Just then, Thomas and Emily arrived. They stopped and looked at the pipes. We have to get through, tooted Thomas. Why don't you go and get Rocky? No, no, whistled Edward. Harvey is doing a fine job. We must be patient. I don't like being patient, pouted Emily. We have a very important job to do. Then they heard Gordon coming. Gordon was rushing along very quickly. He tried to stop when he saw the pipes, but it was too late. He hit them with a loud crunch and came off the track. It was a terrible mess. Gordon lay groaning in a pile of broken pipes. I can't lift Gordon, sighed Harvey. He's too heavy. Edward, tooted Thomas, we need Rocky. Gordon looked up.
Newfangled nonsense,
he sniffed. But Edward knew this was a disaster. Harvey couldn't possibly lift Gordon. There was only one thing to do.
I'll go and get Rocky.
Edward wished and he raced off. Edward steamed back to the docks. Rocky, we need your help, he whistled. It's an emergency.
I'm ready and waiting, Edward,
cried Rocky happily. So Edward buffered up to Rocky and together they left for the junction. Everyone cheered as Edward pulled Rocky up hills and down valleys. He felt very proud to be pulling the newest arrival on Sodor. Edward soon pulled up beside Gordon, bringing Rocky to help. Oh, I can fix this, promised Rocky, smiling. With his mighty crane arm, he lifted Gordon back onto the track. Gordon was very surprised.
Thank you, Rocky,
he huffed.
Good work.
Then Rocky lifted all the pipes off the rails. The job was done in no time.
Gordon and Edward were very impressed. "I was silly to call you newfangled nonsense," wished Edward to Rocky. "You might be new, but you're also really useful. Welcome to our island." Everyone tooted and cheered for Rocky.
Thomas and the Piglets. Thomas loved all the farms on Sodor, but his favourite of all was Farmer Trotter's pig farm. Thomas loved seeing the pigs playing in the mud and hearing them oink happily as he passed by. One day, Farmer Trotter had some exciting news. "One of my pigs is going to have piglets today," he told Thomas. "Could you fetch some soft straw for them from Farmer McColl's farm?" "Of course," Thomas replied. Thomas wheeshed along the track towards Farmer McColl's farm. As he whizzed along, Thomas couldn't stop thinking about the piglets. He wondered if there was anything else he could get for them. As Thomas puffed past the dairy, he saw Percy collecting the milk. "May I have some milk for Farmer Trotter's piglets?" Thomas asked. "Of course," Percy replied, and some milk was loaded into Thomas's truck. Thomas thanked Percy and he chuffed away. As Thomas puffed past the orchard, he saw James collecting apples. "May I have some apples for Farmer Trotter's piglets?" Thomas asked. "Of course," James replied, and some apples were loaded into Thomas's truck. Thomas thanked James and set off again. Then Thomas noticed some children collecting chestnuts in the woods. "May I have some chestnuts for Farmer Trotter's piglets?" Thomas asked. "Of course," the children replied, and they put some bags into Thomas's truck. Thomas thanked them and he set off again. Finally, Thomas rolled into Farmer McColl's yard. "You're late," the farmer said crossly, "and your truck is full, so there's no room for the piglet straw." Thomas hadn't thought about that. "I'll quickly take these things to Farmer Trotter, then I'll come straight back for the straw," Thomas told him. But when Thomas arrived at the pig farm, Farmer Trotter wasn't happy either. "Piglets must have soft straw," he said, "and they'll be born very soon." Thomas emptied his truck and rushed back for the straw. He wheeshed past Percy, James and the children. They all wanted to know about the piglets. "I'm sorry, I can't stop," Thomas peeped. "I must get some soft straw for the piglets." But when Thomas got back to Farmer Trotter's farm, there were no pigs or piglets in sight. Then Thomas saw Farmer Trotter standing by the barn. "You're just in time," he told Thomas. Farmer Trotter opened the barn door, and Thomas saw the new piglets. The farmer scattered the straw on the ground, and the piglets snuggled down to sleep. Thomas was delighted, and best of all, the farmer named one of the piglets Thomas.
Gordon was always boasting and telling the other engines how to behave. One day he was showing off to Edward.
You watch me this afternoon as I rush through with the express. That will be a splendid sight for you when you're shunting trucks.
And before he puffed away, Gordon said,
Don't play around with the trucks, Edward. It isn't wrong, but we just don't do it.
Edward ignored Gordon. It was fun playing with the trucks. He came up quietly behind them and gave them a push. Then he stopped suddenly, and the silly trucks bumped into each other. "Oh!" they cried. "Whatever is happening?" Edward played until there were no more trucks to move. Then he stopped to rest. Suddenly, Edward heard a whistle. It was Gordon, and he was very cross. Instead of pulling nice shiny coaches, he was pulling lots of dirty coal trucks.
A freight train,
he grumbled.
The shame of it.
Gordon went slowly past with the trucks clattering behind him. Edward laughed and went to find more trucks. But soon there was trouble. A porter came and spoke to Edward's driver. "Gordon can't get up the hill," he said. "Will you take Edward to push him, please?" Edward found Gordon halfway up the hill. His driver was very cross with him. "You are not trying," he shouted at Gordon.
I can't do it, replied Gordon. The silly coal trucks are holding me back.
Edward came up behind Gordon's brake van, ready to push.
"You'll be no use at all,"
huffed Gordon. "You wait and see," replied Edward. The guard blew his whistle, and Gordon tried to pull forward as Edward pushed him as hard as he could.
"I can't do it, I can't do it, I can't do it," puffed Gordon.
"I will do it, I will do it, I will do it," puffed Edward. Edward pushed and puffed with all his strength, and before long, Gordon was at the top of the hill.
"I've done it,"
he said proudly, forgetting all about Edward, pushing behind. And Gordon ran on to the next station without stopping to say thank you. But the Fat Controller didn't forget to thank Edward. The next day, he was given a beautiful coat of blue paint with red stripes. Gordon hadn't learned his lesson. He still boasted and told the other engines how to behave. Now it was Henry's turn.
"Henry whistles too much," said Gordon. "Respectable engines don't whistle loudly at stations. It isn't wrong, but we just don't do it."
Poor Henry felt sad. "Never mind," whispered Percy. "I like your whistling." The next morning, as Gordon left the shed, he called to Henry.
"Goodbye, Henry. Be sure and remember what I said about whistling."
Later that day, Henry took a slow train to Edward's station.
"Hello, Henry,"
said Edward. "I was pleased to hear your happy whistle yesterday." "Thank you, Edward," smiled Henry. "Shh! Can you hear something?" Edward listened. Far away, but getting louder and louder, was the sound of an engine's whistle. "It sounds like Gordon," said Edward. "But Gordon never whistles like that." But it was Gordon. He came rushing down the hill at a tremendous speed. Gordon's whistle valve wouldn't close, and he was whistling fit to burst. He screamed through the station and disappeared.
said Edward, looking at Henry.
It isn't wrong, but we just don't do it, chuckled Henry, and Edward laughed. Meanwhile, Gordon screeched along the line.
People came out of their houses, fire engines set off to find the fire, and shoppers dropped their packages in shock. The noise was awful. Porters and passengers held their ears. The Fat Controller held his ears too.
Take him away, he bellowed, and stop that noise.
Still whistling, Gordon puffed sadly away. He whistled as he crossed the point. He whistled into the siding. Gordon was still whistling as the last passenger left the station. Then 2 fitters climbed up and knocked Gordon's whistle valve into place. And at last, there was silence. Gordon shrunk his chin. He was very glad it was empty. He didn't want anyone to make fun of him. Later that evening, the other engines came back. It isn't wrong, murmured Edward, but we just don't do it. And all the engines laughed, except for Gordon. From then on, Gordon was a much quieter, humbler engine. Well, for a few days anyway.
Toby the Tram Engine. Toby was a tram engine. He had cowcatchers and side plates, and a coach called Henrietta. Toby loved people, and was always happy when he could help them out. He was such a cheerful engine that people liked to help him too. Toby and Henrietta worked on a little line near a resort town. They worked very hard, taking cars from the farms to the main line. But they had very few passengers. It's not fair, grumbled Henrietta one day. The buses are always full of passengers, even though they often have accidents. We never have accidents. But I have hardly any passengers. I can't understand it, said Toby, feeling sad. Sometimes the people on the buses laughed at Toby and called him old-fashioned. This made Toby cross. One day, a car stopped nearby, and 2 children jumped out. "Come and look at this engine," called the little boy. A nice-looking, well-dressed gentleman followed them with 2 ladies.
That's a tram engine, explained the gentleman. It's a special kind of steam train.
"Can we have a ride in it?" asked the little girl. They all climbed into Henrietta, and the guard blew his whistle. Toby set off, feeling proud to have passengers. "Hip, hip, hooray!" sang Henrietta as she rattled along. The well-dressed gentleman and his family enjoyed their ride.
"Thank you, Toby," they said.
"Beep, beep," whistled Toby in reply. "Come again soon."
"Oh, we will,"
called the family, and they waved goodbye. As time passed, Toby and Henrietta had fewer and fewer cars to take to the main line, and they had no passengers at all. One morning, the driver looked very sad. "It's our last day, Toby," he said. "The manager says we must close tomorrow." At the end of the day, Toby puffed slowly to his shed. "Nobody wants me," he said unhappily. But the next morning, Toby had a big surprise. A letter had arrived for his driver. "It's from the well-dressed gentleman," said the driver. "Do you remember him, Toby?" "I remember him very well," said Toby.
He knew how to speak to engines. No wonder, said his driver. That gentleman was Sir Topham Hatt. Sir Topham Hatt needed extra help on his railway, and he had thought of the nice little engine he met on vacation. Toby could hardly believe it. Toby and Henrietta set off that day. They were very excited. When they arrived at Tidmouth Sheds, Sir Topham Hatt came to meet them. "Thank you very much for asking me to come, sir," said Toby. "I'm glad you're here, Toby," said Sir Topham Hatt. "I hope you will work hard and be a useful engine, just like Thomas." "I'll try, sir," said Toby. Thomas came up to say hello. He showed Toby what to do, and they were soon very good friends. Toby loved working on Sir Topham Hatt's railway, and he soon learned to be a really useful engine. Next to Thomas's branch line was a little cottage. The lady who lived there liked to see Toby and Thomas puffing past. She always waved to them from her window. "That is Mrs. Kindly," Thomas told Toby. "She isn't very well, and she has to stay in bed all day." "Poor lady," said Toby. "I wish we could help her." From then on, Toby and Thomas always whistled to Mrs. Kindly when they passed her cottage. One day it was raining hard. As Thomas hurried along the track, Toby following behind. Suddenly, Thomas's driver pointed at Mrs. Kindly's cottage. "Something's wrong," he said. A big red cloth was waving out of the cottage window. "Perhaps Mrs. Kindly needs help," said Thomas's fireman. Thomas stopped carefully just before a bend in the track. One day it was raining hard as Thomas hurried along the track with Toby following behind. Suddenly, Thomas's driver and fireman hurried to the cottage. But when they looked around the bend in the track, they understood why Mrs. Kindly had stopped them. "A landslide," said the driver. "Mrs. Kindly has saved our lives." Mrs. Kindly had seen the landslide and had waved her red bathrobe out of the window to warn the engines. The line was cleared the next day, and a very special train puffed along the branch line toward Mrs. Kindly's cottage. First came Toby, then Thomas with Annie and Clarabel, and last of all came Henrietta. Sir Topham Hatt was there too. Everyone wanted to say thank you to Mrs. Kindly. When they reached the bend in the track, they stopped. The people got out and climbed up to the cottage. Toby and Thomas wished they could go too. Thomas's driver gave Mrs. Kindly a new bathrobe. The guard gave her some fruit, and Toby and Thomas sent some coal as a present. "The engines and I would like to give you these tickets for a trip to the seashore," said Sir Topham Hatt. "We hope you will get better in the sunshine." "Oh, you are very kind," said Mrs. Kindly. Toby and Thomas blew their whistles to say thank you. Toby felt very happy that he had come to work on Sir Topham Hatt's railway. "Hip, hip, hooray!" sang Henrietta. The Fat Controller. One morning, the Fat Controller was eating his usual breakfast of toast and marmalade. Lady Hat was pouring him a cup of coffee when the telephone rang. "Oh, bother that telephone," said the Fat Controller, frowning. "I'm sorry, my dear," he said to Lady Hat a few minutes later. "The engines are not behaving themselves. I must go at once. Engines on my railway do as they are told." When he arrived at the main station, there was a tremendous noise. The passengers waiting on the platform were angry. The Fat Controller went into his office and sat down behind his desk.
Moments later, the station master knocked on the door. "There's trouble in the shed, sir," he said. "Henry is sulking, there's no train, and the passengers are saying this is a bad railway." "Oh, indeed," said the Fat Controller. "We cannot allow that."
Skarloey!
At the sheds, the Fat Controller found Gordon, James and Henry looking very cross. "Come along, Henry. It's time your train was ready," said the Fat Controller firmly.
Henry's not going, said Gordon. We won't shunt like common tank engines. That is Thomas's job.
"We are important tender engines. Fetch our coaches and we will pull them."
Tender engines don't shunt,
puffed Henry. "Oh, indeed," said the Fat Controller. "We'll see about that. Engines on my railway do as they are told." And he hurried away in his car to find Edward. "The yard has never been the same since Thomas left to run his branch line," he thought sadly, and he took out a handkerchief to mop his brow. Meanwhile, Edward was shunting. "Leave those trucks, please, Edward," said the Fat Controller. "I want you to push coaches for me in the yard." "Thank you, sir. That'll be a nice change," said Edward happily. "That's a good engine. Off you go, then." So Edward found coaches for Gordon, James and Henry. And that day, the trains ran as usual. The Fat Controller went to the workshop and inspected all sorts of engines. At last, he saw a little green tank engine with 4 wheels. "Ah, that's the one," he thought. The Fat Controller knew a really useful engine when he saw one. "If I choose you, will you work hard?" he said. "Oh, sir! Yes, sir!" peeped the little green engine. "That's a good engine. I'll call you Percy," smiled the Fat Controller, and he drove him all the way back to the yard. "Edward," he called, "here's Percy. Will you show him what to do?" Percy soon learned what needed to be done, and he and Edward had a happy afternoon. Then Henry steamed by, hissing as usual. "Wheesh!" little Percy hissed back. Henry was so surprised, he almost jumped off the track. The next day, the Fat Controller arrived. Edward, Thomas and Percy were excited. He told the engines that Henry, Gordon and James were sulking. "They refused to shunt like common tank engines, so I have shut them in the shed. I want you to run the line for a while." "Common tank engines indeed," snorted Thomas. "We'll show them." "And Percy will help too." "Thank you, sir," whistled Percy with delight. Edward and Thomas worked the main line, peeping to each other as they passed by. Percy puffed along the branch line, carrying passengers to their stations. Thomas was worried about Annie and Clarabel, but his driver and guard promised to look after them. There were fewer trains, but the passengers didn't mind. They knew the 3 naughty engines were being taught a lesson. In the shed, Gordon, James and Henry were cold, lonely and miserable. There was no coal for them, no washdown, and they missed their passengers. They wished they hadn't been so silly. The next morning, the Fat Controller visited the shed. He could see that the engines had learned their lesson.
"We are sorry, sir," said Gordon.
"We were too big for our buffers," added James.
"Remember, only really useful engines can work on my railway," said the Fat Controller.
He knew just how to handle difficult engines. And from that moment on, the 3 tender engines were never moved to tank engines again. Thomas and the Dinosaur. One day, Percy rushed into the shed. "I saw a monster in the forest," he said. "What's a monster?" Thomas asked. "Monsters are very big animals with very big teeth," Percy answered. "And they eat engines." Thomas was a little bit scared to go near the forest, but he had work to do. Suddenly he saw a very big animal with very big teeth. "Monster!" Thomas shouted as he raced back to tell Percy. "I saw it," Thomas said with a shudder. "The monster?" Percy asked. "Yes," Thomas replied, "but I got away." Just then, the Fat Controller came into the shed. "Thomas," he said, "I need you to bring a special load from the forest." Now Thomas was really worried. What if he met up with the monster again? Slowly, slowly, Thomas puffed back to the forest with his driver. Through the trees, Thomas again saw that very big animal with the very big teeth. "Monster!" he shouted to his driver. "That's not a monster," the driver said. "That's just a model of a dinosaur." "What's a dinosaur?" Thomas asked him. "Dinosaurs were animals that lived a long, long time ago," the driver explained. "This is a model for Sodor's new dinosaur park." Thomas chugged a little closer and saw that his driver was right. Soon, Harold the helicopter arrived to lift the dinosaur. Then some workers guided Harold as he carefully lowered the model onto Thomas's flatbed. Percy was puffing along the line when Thomas passed by. "Monster!" Percy shouted when he saw the dinosaur. "Don't worry, Percy," Thomas said to his friend. "This is not a monster at all. This is a dinosaur model for the new dinosaur park." Thomas was very proud to be carrying the dinosaur model. He rolled past the schoolyard with the dinosaur, and the children waved with excitement. "Beep, beep," Thomas called. Finally, Thomas reached the dinosaur park. The Fat Controller met him there. "Good work, Thomas," said the Fat Controller. "You've been very useful today." The dinosaur was placed in a spot where everyone could see it, from inside the park and out. And every time he passed by, Thomas smiled and gave a special peep peep. Belle's new friend. Everyone liked the new engine, Belle. She was a big blue engine with a big bell. Belle could fight fires with a whoosh of water.
One day when Thomas puffed into Knapford Station, he saw Belle watching Toby trundling away. "Who's that, Thomas?" Belle asked. "He has a bell too. I'm sure we'd be good friends." Thomas told Belle all about Toby and where to find his hut. Belle wheeshed straight to Toby's hut. Belle was noisy and big. She made Toby feel very small. Toby told Belle that he liked to be quiet and listen to the birds singing. "I know how we can have much more fun than that," said Belle. "Follow me." Belle took Toby to the bottom of a hill. "Let's race to the top and then whoosh down," she cried. And off she puffed at full speed. "That was fun," laughed Belle, as she came to a stop. But Toby didn't answer, because Toby wasn't there. "I'm no good at racing," said Toby, when Belle found him. "Don't worry," Belle replied. She really wanted Toby to have fun and to be her friend. "I know what we'll do." And she raced off to a field full of pigs, with Toby following behind. "I like pigs," said Toby. "They make me happy." That made Belle happy too. Then she had an idea. "Pigs like mud, don't they?" she said. And she whooshed water from her spouts into the field. But Toby didn't answer, because Toby wasn't there. "I don't like whooshing water," said Toby, when Belle found him. "Don't worry," she replied. "Follow me." And she chuffed off to Maithwaite Station and rang her big loud bell for all the passengers to hear. Ding, 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 ding. "We're the bells of Sodor," laughed Belle. "Ring your bell for the passengers, Toby." But Toby didn't answer, because Toby wasn't there. Belle was worried. She wanted to find Toby. She wheeshed away to look for him. Belle found Toby hiding in his shed. "You didn't have any fun," said Belle sadly. "And now you won't want to be my friend." They both sat quietly. Belle heard the birds singing. "That's beautiful," she said. And Toby smiled. Then Toby had an idea. He took Belle back to the pigs. Quietly they watched the pigs, snorting and snuffling. Belle didn't make Toby feel small anymore. Then they went back to the station, and Toby jingled and jangled his bell for the passengers. Belle rang her big bell as quietly as she could. "Belle is my friend," Toby told everyone. "We're the bells of Sodor." And Belle smiled from buffer to buffer. Bertie the Bus. One day, Thomas was waiting at the junction when a bus came into the yard. "Hello," said Thomas. "Who are you?" "I'm Bertie. Who are you?" "I'm Thomas. I run this branch line." "Oh, I remember now," said Bertie. "You were stuck in the snow. I took your passengers and Terence the tractor pulled you out. I've come to help you with your passengers today." "Help me?" said Thomas crossly. "I don't need any help. Anyway, I can go faster than you." "You can't," said Bertie. "I can," puffed Thomas. "I'll race you," said Bertie. Their drivers agreed to the race. "Are you ready?" said the station master. And they were off. Thomas always had to start off slowly, and Bertie was soon ahead of him. But Thomas didn't hurry.
Why don't you go fast? Why don't you go fast?
Called Annie and Clarabel anxiously.
Wait and see,
hissed Thomas.
He's a long way ahead,
They wailed. But Thomas didn't mind. He remembered the railroad crossing. Bertie was there, waiting impatiently at the gates, while Thomas and his coaches went sailing through. "Goodbye, Bertie," called Thomas. After that, the road left the railway, so Thomas, Annie and Clarabel couldn't see Bertie. Then they had to stop at a station to let some passengers off. "Beep, beep, beep! Quickly, please!" called Thomas. Everybody got out quickly. The guard blew his whistle and off they went again. Come along, sang Thomas. We're coming along, sang Annie and Clarabel. Hurry, panted Thomas. Then he looked ahead and saw Bertie crossing the bridge over the railway, tooting triumphantly on his horn. Oh, dearie me, groaned Thomas. Steady, Thomas, said his driver. We'll beat Bertie yet. We'll beat Bertie yet, echoed Annie and Clarabel. We'll do it, panted Thomas. Oh, no, there's a station. As Thomas stopped, he heard a toot. Goodbye, Thomas, called Bertie. You must be tired. Sorry I can't stop. We buses have to work, you know. Goodbye. The next station was by the river. They got there quickly, but the signal was up. Oh dear, thought Thomas. We've lost. But at the station, he had a drink of water and felt much better. Then the signal dropped. Hurrah, we're off! Hurrah, we're off! Puffed Thomas happily. As Thomas crossed the bridge, he heard an impatient toot toot. There was Bertie waiting at the traffic lights. But as soon as the lights changed, Bertie started with a roar and chased after Thomas. Now Thomas reached his full speed. Bertie tried hard, but Thomas was too fast. Whistling joyfully, he plunged into the tunnel, leaving Bertie far behind. I've done it, panted Thomas. We've done it, hooray, chanted Annie and Clarabel as they whooshed into the last station. The passengers all cheered loudly. When Bertie came in, they also gave him a big welcome. Well done, Thomas, said Bertie. That was fun. I would have to grow wings like an airplane to beat you over that hill. Thomas and Bertie now keep each other busy. Bertie finds people who want to travel by train and takes them to Thomas, while Thomas brings the people to the station for Bertie to take home. They often talk about their race, but Bertie's passengers don't like being bounced around like peas in a pan. And Sir Topham Hatt has told Thomas not to race at dangerous speeds. So although, between you and me, they would like to have another race, I don't think they ever will. Do you? Thomas and the Shark. Thomas is at Brendam Docks. All the engines are very busy today. There is a lot of cargo. They must take it around Sodor. Percy picks up mail. Henry picks up steel. Thomas picks up flour. It's almost time to get moving. But then all the engines crowd around Salty. Thomas cannot see what is going on. He asks James. "Salty has a shark," says James. Salty will take the shark to the Sodor Aquarium. It will live there with other sea animals. Thomas wants to see the shark. The other engines are in his way. Thomas cannot wait any longer. He has work to do. He leaves the docks. The other engines stay to see the shark. They try to get closer. Gordon wants to get the closest. He bumps Cranky's hook. Cranky's hook bumps into the shark truck. The shark truck comes loose. The shark truck rolls away. It starts to roll down a hill. Oh no! Salty must stop it. The shark truck rolls and rolls. It moves faster and faster. Salty chases it. The shark truck goes over a bridge. It goes into a tunnel. Gordon tries to catch it. Percy tries too. The shark truck goes around a bend. It is moving fast. James and Emily try to help. None of the engines can catch up. The shark truck is too fast. Thomas is on his way to the bakery. He is still sad that he missed the shark. He hears peeps and shouts. Thomas stops. He looks up the hill. He sees the shark. It is rolling right towards him. Thomas speeds up. He gets in front of the shark truck. He drops flour on the track. The flour slows down the shark truck. Thomas stops the shark. Salty and the other engines catch up. Salty thanks Thomas. All the engines cheer. "Will you take the shark to the aquarium?" Salty asks Thomas. Thomas says yes. He delivers the shark safe and sound. Thomas is a hero. Edward the Blue Engine. Edward was getting old. His parts were worn and the big engines called him Old Iron because he clanked as he worked. One day he was taking some empty cattle trucks to the market. "Come on, come on, come on," puffed Edward as he clanked along the line. "Oh, oh, oh," screamed the rattling trucks. Some cows were grazing in a field by the line when Edward clattered past. The noise and smoke upset them. They twitched their tails and ran. The cows charged across the field. They broke through the fence and crashed into the last few trucks. A coupling rod broke and half the troublesome trucks were left behind. Edward felt the trucks jerk suddenly, but he thought they were being naughty as usual. "Those troublesome trucks," he cried. "Why can't they come quietly?" Edward had reached the next station before he realised what had happened. News of the accident quickly reached the other engines.
Silly old Iron. Fancy allowing cows to break his train,
laughed Gordon.
They wouldn't dare do that to me. I'd show them,
he boasted. Edward pretended not to mind, but Toby was cross. "Don't worry, Edward," he said. "Gordon's very mean to call you names. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Cows can be very troublesome." This made Edward feel a little better. A few days later, Gordon rushed through Edward's station.
"Watch out for the cows!"
he laughed as he roared along the line. But his driver could see something on the bridge ahead.
"Slow down, Gordon,"
he said, and shut off the steam.
"Bah,"
said Gordon.
"It's only a cow."
"Shoo!" he hissed, moving slowly onto the bridge. But the cow wouldn't shoo. She had lost her calf and felt lonely. Gordon stopped.
"Be off,"
he hissed. But the cow kept walking toward him and mooed even louder. Gordon was scared and backed slowly away. His driver and fireman tried to send the cow away, but she wouldn't move. The guard told the porter at the nearest station.
"That must be Bluebell," said the porter. "Her calf is here. We'll bring it to her now."
"Moo!" bellowed Bluebell when she saw her calf, and she nuzzled her happily. Gordon was very quiet on his way back to the station. He hoped no one had heard about Bluebell, but the story soon spread.
"Well, well, well,"
chuckled Edward.
"A big engine like you afraid of a little cow?" "I wasn't afraid," huffed Gordon. "I didn't want the poor thing to hurt herself by running into me."
"Yes, Gordon," said Edward solemnly, but he knew the real reason why Gordon had stopped. A few days later, Edward was late with the passengers for James's train.
"It's old Iron again," grumbled James. "Edward always keeps us waiting."
Thomas and Percy were annoyed. "Old Iron?" they snorted. "Why, Edward could beat you in a race any day."
"Really?" huffed James. "I should like to see him do it."
Edward heard James as he pulled into the station, but he just smiled. Later that week, James's driver didn't feel well. His fireman was phoning for a relief driver when he heard the signalman shout. James was puffing away without a driver. His fireman ran after him, but James was going too fast. The signalman had to halt the other trains to make sure there wasn't an accident. "Two boys were standing on James's footplate," explained the signalman when James's fireman returned. "Edward is bringing the inspector. He needs a pole and a coil of wire rope." James's fireman was waiting with the pole and rope when Edward arrived. "Good man," said the inspector. "Jump in, don't worry, we'll catch him," puffed Edward. By now, James was very frightened. He had realised that he didn't have a driver. "I can't stop," he wailed. "Help! Help!" "We're coming," cried Edward.
and he puffed with every ounce of steam he had until he was level with James's buffer beam. The inspector carefully climbed out of Edward's cab and stood on his front. He had made a noose out of the rope and tied it to the end of the pole. He was trying to slip it over James's buffer. The engine swayed and lurched, and the inspector nearly fell, but he saved himself just in time. At last he did it. "Got him!" he shouted, and pulled the noose tight around James's buffer. Then he carefully climbed back into Edward's cab. Edward's driver braked gently, so he didn't snap the rope, and James's fireman scrambled across and took control of James. Edward and James puffed back side by side. "So, Old Iron caught you after all," chuckled Edward. "I'm sorry," whispered James. "Thank you for saving me. You were splendid." When they reached the station, Sir Topham Hatt was waiting.
That was a fine piece of work, he said. I'm proud of you, Edward. You shall go to the works and have your worn parts mended.
"Oh, thank you, sir," said Edward happily. "It will be lovely not to clank any more." James's driver soon got better and went back to work. The naughty boys had gotten such a shock when James started moving that they decided to wait until they were much older before trying to drive a train again. When Edward came home, he felt like a new engine. James and all the other engines gave him a tremendous welcome. Even Gordon let out a cheer. Edward was very happy that he would never be called Old Iron again. Molly the bright yellow engine. It was a blustery evening on the island of Sodor. Thomas was passing through one of his favourite stations. "Toot toot!" called Thomas to the station master. Thomas liked this station because every evening the station master put up lots of lanterns all along the platform. But Thomas was also busy thinking about the next day. "I wonder what Molly, the new engine, will be like," he chuckled. When Thomas pulled into Brendam Docks the next morning, he spotted Molly right away. She was waiting in a siding, looking very sad. "What's the matter?" puffed Thomas. "Emily made fun of me because I have to take empty trucks to the coaling plant," replied Molly sadly. Just then, the signal turned to red. Gordon thundered past with the express.
You wait there, he chuffed. My express is more important than your empty trucks.
Molly chugged off very sadly. As Thomas wondered what he could do, the wind blew up over some containers covered in tarpaulin. The tarpaulin began to rustle. "That's it!" puffed Thomas happily. He raced off to find Molly. With the help of Molly's driver, Thomas and Molly covered her trucks with the tarpaulin. "With your trucks covered, no one will know they are empty," explained Thomas. "We'll make them think you're carrying a very special delivery." Thomas spent a busy day telling everyone about Molly's special. Percy and Edward were talking to Thomas in Knapford Station when Gordon pulled in.
I don't care what you say, Thomas, puffed Gordon. Nothing can be as important as my express.
"It can," chugged Thomas angrily. "Be at Abbey Station tonight and you will see just how special Molly's special is." As the engines pulled away, Thomas realised what he had said.
How am I going to make Molly's special even more special? Thomas chuffed thoughtfully. He pulled into his favourite station, just as the station master was lighting his lanterns. This gave Thomas another idea. Can I borrow your lanterns? He puffed. Although the station master was a little curious, he was happy to lend Thomas his lanterns. Thomas loaded up his trucks and sped off. That evening, Molly waited for Thomas at the coaling plant. Hello, Molly, puffed Thomas happily. I have had another idea about how to make your special even more special. And Thomas told Molly all about his plan. Very soon, Molly was covered in lanterns and heading happily for Abbey Station. Toot toot, whistled Percy and Emily as Molly arrived at the station. I feel very special, chuffed Molly with a big smile on her face. Thank you, Thomas. Suddenly, a big gust of wind blew right through the station. It lifted the tarpaulin covering Molly's empty trucks and blew out the lanterns. Everyone could see that there was nothing underneath.
I knew your trucks couldn't be as important as my express,
chuffed Gordon, smiling. Molly screeched out of the station. She wanted to be as far away from all the other engines as possible. Well, chuffed Emily, what are you going to do now, Thomas? Poor Molly, you have just made her look very silly. Thomas, the station master called across the platform. Where's Molly? The fat controller has just phoned. There are engines waiting at the coaling plant. They need Molly's empty trucks so they can deliver the coal. Thomas raced out of the yard looking for Molly. He went all around the island. Eventually, he found Molly stopped in a sidewalk. I'm very sorry, apologized Thomas, but I have some really good news, he chuffed merrily. Your empty trucks are very important. They need them at the coaling plant right now. But I've nearly run out of coal, sobbed Molly, more upset than before. Don't worry, chuffed Thomas. I'll help you. Okay, Thomas, you push and I'll pull, puffed Molly. Very soon, the two engines were working together to get Molly and her empty trucks to the coaling plant. The coaling plant engines were very glad to see Molly and her empty trucks. Quick, quick, they chugged. We need to start our deliveries, and we need your empty trucks to carry the coal. Look how important your trucks are, puffed Thomas. Molly looked around at her trucks, being used to help the coaling plant engines, and thought what a special engine she was. She was so proud, it made her axles tingle. More trucks, called out Henry, one of the coaling plant engines. Without a moment's thought, Molly rushed past Thomas, whistling, I'll get more trucks, I'll get more cars. Molly couldn't wait to begin pulling empty trucks again. And I'll help, puffed Thomas. Molly and Thomas raced back to the yard to pick up some more trucks. Just as they were leaving the yard with their empty trucks, the signal turned to red. But this time, Gordon and his express had to wait. Out of the way, puffed Molly. Empty trucks coming through. You see, laughed Thomas. Sometimes empty trucks are more important than your express. Molly felt even more special.
Now she knew what it was like to be a really useful engine. She was never going to feel bad about pulling empty trucks again. Skarloey, the strong engine. Skarloey worked on the little railway on the island of Sodor. He was 100 years old, but he was still a useful engine. All the other engines liked Skarloey, and he would tell them stories about when he was young. Everyone's favourite story was about the time Skarloey first came to the little railway. Skarloey was built at the same time as another engine called Rheneas. They were both red with 4 wheels each.
We look wonderful, said Skarloey proudly.
We will pull coaches and everyone will want to ride in them, replied Rheneas. Skarloey and Rheneas were both going to work on the mountain line of the little railway. But Skarloey was finished first, so he had to go to the little railway alone, leaving Rheneas behind. The 2 engines felt sad when they said goodbye to each other. Skarloey was sent away on a ship. It was very wobbly. At the port, they used the ship's cranes to lift Skarloey onto the shore. The ship's cranes were called derricks, and they nearly turned Skarloey upside down.
How dare they treat me like this, said Skarloey crossly.
He was left hanging from the derricks for a long time. At last, an engine arrived to take him to the mountain line. It was dark when Skarloey arrived at the mountain line. He felt lonely and miserable. I wish Rheneas was here, he said sadly. Next morning, there were freight trucks everywhere. They rattled and roared past Skarloey. There's no engine pulling them, said Skarloey in surprise. The trucks come down the mountain by gravity, explained the manager. But the empty ones need to be taken up again. That's why you're here.
What?
Said Skarloey crossly.
I don't want to pull freight trucks. Can't I pull coaches, sir?
Certainly not, said the manager. We have to finish building this line, and for that we need freight trucks. The inspector is coming to look at the line soon. Skarloey was furious. When the workers tried to start him, his fire wouldn't burn. He made no steam. He just blew smoke at them. They tried again the next day, and the next, and the next. But Skarloey wouldn't do a thing. Finally, the manager lost his temper.
We are not going to look at your sulky face all day, Skarloey, he said. We'll leave you alone until you're a better engine.
They covered Skarloey with a big sheet of tarpaulin and went away. Skarloey felt even more lonely and unhappy. Nobody talked to him. At last, the manager came back. I hope that you will be a better engine from now on, he said.
Yes, sir, I will, sir,
said Skarloey earnestly. From then on, Skarloey worked very hard, and although he sometimes got too excited and would bounce up and down, the manager was very pleased with his efforts. By the time Rheneas arrived, the line was ready. Skarloey was delighted to see his old friend. Rheneas soon settled in. One day while he was shunting trucks, Skarloey hurried up to him.
I'm going to pull the inspector's train today, said Skarloey.
Be careful not to bounce, said Rheneas. The inspector won't like that. But Skarloey was so excited, he just couldn't stop bouncing. Skarloey had to take the inspector up to the top of the mountain and then back down again. The upward journey went well, and Skarloey felt very happy. When it was time to go down, Skarloey was really excited. As they went faster and faster, he began to bounce. The coaches were scared. "He's playing tricks," they said. "Bump him, bump him!" Just then, Skarloey gave an extra big bounce, and the inspector lost his footing. He flew into a bush on the side of the line. The driver stopped the train. The inspector was not hurt, but he was very cross. "From now on, you will stay in the shed," he said to Skarloey. "You are a bad engine." When the inspector told the manager what had happened, the manager felt sorry for Skarloey. He knew that he had been trying very hard to be good. "What Skarloey needs is an extra pair of wheels," he said. "Then he won't bounce anymore." So Skarloey was sent off to the works. When Skarloey came back, Rheneas hardly recognized him. He had 6 wheels and a brand new cab, and he looked very smart. "Now let's see what you can do," said the manager. Sure enough, Skarloey found it much easier to travel along smoothly without bouncing. From then on, Skarloey pulled coaches and freight cars up and down the track as easily as anything. And he didn't bounce his passengers once. 100 years later, he is still as good as new. Happy Hiro. One morning, Thomas saw Percy and Hiro at Knapford Station. "Good morning," he tooted loudly. "Good morning," Percy peeped. But Hiro didn't toot a greeting. "You seem sad, Hiro," Thomas said. "Maybe a little," Hiro replied, as he steamed quietly out of the station. Thomas met Charlie at the docks. "Hiro's feeling sad," he told Charlie. "Can you cheer him up with a riddle?" "Hiro," Charlie called loudly, "what has 4 legs but never walks?" "I don't know, Charlie," Hiro replied. "A table," laughed Charlie. But Hiro didn't smile as he slowly puffed away. Thomas asked why Hiro was feeling sad. "I miss my home," Hiro replied. "I could puff along quietly there. I'm an older engine, so I like to puff along quietly." But Thomas didn't listen to Hiro. He thought he knew how to cheer him up. Thomas took Hiro to the hollow tree tunnel. Hiro smiled when he heard the birds singing. But Thomas didn't listen to the birds. "This will make you happy," he said, as he raced along the tunnel. Hiro was tired. "I just want to puff along quietly," he said. But Thomas had another idea. Thomas took Hiro to Misty Island. Hiro smiled when he saw the sea. But Thomas didn't look at it. "Come on," Thomas said, as he raced along the bumpy tracks. "I just want to puff along quietly," Hiro said. But Thomas didn't listen. At the logging station, Hiro smiled when he saw some Joby logs.
There must be Joby trees we can visit, he said. But Thomas wasn't listening. I want this to stop, Hiro said tiredly. I'm sorry, Thomas replied. I thought I could make you happy, but instead I've made you unhappy. Thomas tooted softly as he realized where he had gone wrong. Hiro, you told me what makes you happy, but I didn't listen. Would you puff along quietly with me now? He asked gently. Of course, Thomas. Hiro smiled. I would be happy to. First, Thomas took Hiro to look at the sea. This is beautiful, Hiro said. It's just like home. Can I take you somewhere else to puff along quietly? Thomas asked. Of course, Thomas. Hiro smiled. Then Thomas took Hiro to the hollow tree tunnel. Hiro smiled as birds landed on him. Can I take you somewhere else to puff along quietly? Thomas asked. Of course you can, Hiro said eagerly. Thomas took Hiro to see where the Joby trees grew. Hiro gasped when he saw the magnificent trees. This is wonderful! I am very happy, Hiro told Thomas, and he smiled, his biggest smile of the day. You are a very kind friend, Thomas, Hiro told him. Thank you for this special day. Thomas beamed from buffer to buffer. Then the two engines puffed slowly and happily together back to the engine sheds. Spencer, the express train. One day, the Duke and Duchess came to Sodor for a visit. Gordon hoped that he would have the special job of showing the important visitors around the island. But to Gordon's disappointment, the Duke and Duchess brought their own engine with them. His name was Spencer, and he was the shiniest, sleekest engine that Gordon had ever seen. That afternoon, there was to be a party at Marin Station for the Duke and Duchess. That's on the other side of Gordon's Hill, James told Spencer.
You'll need to take on plenty of water,
Gordon added helpfully. I have plenty of water, wheezed Spencer as he steamed out of the yard. But when Spencer reached Gordon's Hill, he began to struggle. The hill was long and steep. He puffed, he panted, he pulled with all his might. But Spencer had run out of steam. His driver had to phone for help. Back at the station master told Gordon, "The Fat Controller has a job for you. There's an engine stuck on a hill." Gordon set off at once. Gordon was surprised to find Spencer. "What's wrong?" he asked. "No water," snapped Spencer. "I must have a leaky tank."
Perhaps, smiled Gordon. But we'd better hurry. Everyone is waiting for the Duke and Duchess.
Soon Gordon was coupled up to Spencer and they set off. Minutes later, they arrived at Marin Station. The party was ready to begin.
"Well done, Gordon," said the Fat Controller. "You are a very useful engine."
Gordon glowed with pride.
Spencer was a very fast engine. One day when he pulled into Knapford Station, his driver had exciting news for him. "You have beaten Gordon's record," he said. "Of course," boasted Spencer. "I'm faster and finer than all the engines on Sodor put together." The Fat Controller's engines were very cross. Spencer was taking the Duke and Duchess to their summer house. The Fat Controller came to tell his engines that one of them was needed to carry their furniture. The engines saw the chance for a race. "Please, sir," said Thomas, James and Gordon all together. "May I go?" But the Fat Controller told Edward to go instead. James and Gordon groaned. Edward was an old engine and not as strong and as fast as the others. "Oh, he'll lose the race and let the whole railway down," said James. Thomas and Percy were cross with James. Edward was their friend. "You can beat that big silver show-off any day," they told him. Slowly and steadily, Edward set off. "We'll do my best, we'll do my best," he puffed. But Spencer quickly passed Edward. "I've won already," he boasted, and with a whoosh, he was gone. Edward came to the bottom of a steep hill. The furniture was heavy, and he felt tired. But Donald and Douglas were waiting at the junction. They had heard about the race. "Hooray for Edward!" cried Donald. "He's a first-rate engine," added Douglas. This made Edward feel much better. He huffed and puffed, and soon he had climbed to the top of the hill. He raced down the other side to catch up with Spencer. Spencer happily steamed along. Up ahead was the siding leading to the summer house, but the Duke wanted to take some photographs of the countryside. Spencer stopped and the Duke set up his camera. Spencer closed his eyes. "Nothing to worry about," he said lazily. Before long, Spencer was fast asleep.
Train lights had gone off, and in fact, because that's not the reason, he decided we used to enjoy the gravy trials.
When the Duke had finished taking photographs, Spencer's driver rang the bell. "Time to go," he said. Nothing happened. Spencer was dreaming of winning the race. He didn't hear the bell, and he didn't hear Edward puffing past him. Spencer's driver rang the bell again and again. Finally, Spencer opened his eyes. He couldn't believe what he saw. Edward was heading toward the summer house. Nearly there, gasped the old engine. Spencer took off as fast as he could, but he was too late. Edward pulled to a stop in front of the summer house. "I've won!" he gasped. "I did it!" Suddenly his pistons didn't ache, and his axles weren't shaking. Edward felt like the pride of the Sodor Railway. And he was right. The Tall Friend. A new safari park was opening, and all the engines had important jobs to do. Percy and Edward's trucks were full of food for the animals. "I'm taking the tallest animal to the park," puffed Thomas excitedly. The other engines tried to guess what it could be. It was a giraffe. All the engines wheezed with wonder. Thomas couldn't wait to show the children the tallest animal on Sodor. "You must wait for the giraffe keeper," said Cranky.
But Thomas was in too much of a rush, and he puffed away. Thomas puffed happily along with the giraffe, but it wasn't long before they came to a low bridge. "Sit down, Mr. Giraffe," Thomas chuffed. But the giraffe didn't want to sit down, so they couldn't fit under the bridge. Thomas heard a whistle. It was Gordon. "Out of the way!" Gordon tooted crossly. "You must get the keeper. The giraffe will do what he tells him." "Oh, I can manage," puffed Thomas, and he reversed into a siding. Then Edward chuffed up with his trucks full of rosy red apples. The apples gave Thomas an idea. Perhaps the giraffe would get sleepy and sit down if he ate some apples. The giraffe liked Edward's apples. He ate and ate and ate, but he didn't sit down. Edward was upset that all his apples had been eaten. "You must go back and get the keeper, Thomas," Edward puffed crossly. Thomas was worried. The Fat Controller was waiting for him, and he still couldn't get under the bridge. Just then, Percy puffed along with a truck full of leaves. Thomas thought the giraffe might sit down if he ate some of the leaves. The giraffe loved the leaves. He munched and munched until there were none left. And then, finally, he sat down and closed his eyes. "He's asleep," peeped Thomas. "At last, we can go under the bridge to the safari park." Thomas clickety-clacked along the track and under the bridge all the way to the safari park. The Fat Controller was there, and he was cross. There were no apples and no leaves for the animals to eat, and the tallest animal was fast asleep. "I'm sorry, sir," wheezed Thomas. "I should have waited for the keeper." Thomas puffed his fastest to fetch the keeper and take him to the park, and then he chuffed away to get more apples and more leaves. When Thomas finally puffed back into the safari park, the giraffe was wide awake. He heard Thomas toot and stretched out his long neck to his new friend. "Welcome to Sodor, Mr. Giraffe," peeped Thomas happily. "It's a wonderful place to live." Rosie the Little Purple Engine. It was the stormy season on the Island of Sodor, and Thomas was busy delivering mail to a far part of the island. At the end of the line, on a farm at the top of the high hill, lived a little girl called Alice. Today was Alice's birthday, and Thomas was going to deliver all her birthday cards and presents. While Thomas was at the station being loaded up, Rosie, a little purple tank engine, pulled up beside him. "Hello, Thomas," puffed Rosie. Her puff was almost exactly like Thomas's.
Rosie tried to do everything just like Thomas. She tried to wheeze like him, and she tried to whistle like him. She liked Thomas so much that she wanted to be just like him. Thomas didn't like this. It made him cross. "Where are you going?" asked Rosie. "It's Alice's birthday," replied Thomas. "I'm taking all her presents to High Farm. I'm going to make sure she gets them all on time." Just then, Harold swooped down.
I'm afraid I've got a storm warning, he whirred. You had better be careful on those high tracks, Thomas. The winds can cause landslides up there.
Thomas didn't want to let Alice down. "High winds don't bother me," he puffed. "Or me," puffed Rosie. "I'll come as your back engine." But Thomas didn't want Rosie to come. "No, thank you, I'll manage on my own," he chuffed, and he pulled away quickly. But Rosie wouldn't take no for an answer. She cheekily followed him. Thomas sped along the line to High Farm. His engine was working very hard. The sky grew darker and darker, and soon rain was pouring down. "Rosie can't follow me now," thought Thomas. "She isn't strong enough." But Thomas was wrong. Rosie was following right behind. She whistled cheerfully. Thomas was very annoyed. When he came to the next junction, Thomas could either take the longer, easier track to High Farm or the shorter and harder track. Thomas knew the longer way was safer, especially in such stormy weather. "I'll take the shorter way," he wished. "Then Rosie won't follow me." Thomas puffed furiously up the steep track as the storm grew stronger and stronger. Thomas was sure Rosie couldn't be behind him now. All of a sudden, there was a loud crack. Stones tumbled down the bank in front of Thomas. They covered the track completely. Thomas couldn't go forward. "Cinders and ashes!" he cried. What was Thomas going to do now? He still wanted to deliver Alice's presents, but the track was blocked. "I'll just have to bash my way through," thought Thomas. Soon Thomas was up to his buffers in mud and stones. He tried to push on, but he couldn't. He tried to back out, but he couldn't. Thomas was stuck. Beep, beep! Another engine was coming up the track. It was Rosie. Thomas felt very silly, but he was very glad to see Rosie. "I'll go and get help," she chuffed. "Wait," puffed Thomas. "Will you please deliver Alice's presents for me?" Rosie was very happy that Thomas had asked her to deliver Alice's presents. "Of course I will," she chuffed happily. Rosie was soon coupled up to Thomas's trucks. She pulled away and steamed back to the longer, safer track to High Farm. Thomas waited for Rosie to come back. He was very happy Rosie had followed him after all. Very soon, Rosie came puffing back down the line. "Alice's mother has telephoned for help," she told Thomas. "Edward is coming to pull you out." Then Thomas noticed that Rosie had a passenger on board. It was Alice. "Thank you for making sure I got my presents," Alice told Thomas. "They were very nice." "I couldn't have done it without Rosie's help," chuffed Thomas truthfully. "Now we can all celebrate your birthday together." Thomas peeped happily. Rosie peeped too, just like Thomas.
Thomas the Tank Engine. Thomas the Tank Engine had 6 small wheels, a short stumpy funnel, and a short stumpy boiler, and a short stumpy dome. He was a fussy little engine, always pulling coaches back and forth. He pulled them to the station for the big engines to take out on journeys. And when trains came in, he pulled the empty coaches away so that the big engines could have a rest. But what Thomas really wanted was his very own branch line. That way he would be a really useful engine. Thomas was a cheeky little engine. He thought no engine worked as hard as he did, and he liked playing tricks on the others. One day, Gordon had just returned from pulling the big express. He was very tired and had just gone to sleep when Thomas came up beside him. "Wake up, lazy bones!" whistled Thomas. "Do some hard work for a change!" And he ran off laughing. Gordon got a terrible shock. He decided he had to pay Thomas back. The next morning, Thomas wouldn't wake up. His driver and fireman couldn't make him start. It was nearly time for Gordon's express to leave. Gordon was waiting, but Thomas hadn't gotten his coaches ready. At last, Thomas started. "Oh dear," he yawned. "Poop, poop, poop! Hurry up, you!" said Gordon crossly. "Peep, peep, peep! Hurry up yourself!" replied Thomas cheekily. Thomas usually pushed behind Gordon's train to help him start, but he was always uncoupled first, so that when the train was running nicely, Thomas could stop and go back. That morning, Gordon saw the perfect chance to pay Thomas back for frightening him. He started so quickly that the guards forgot to uncouple Thomas. Gordon moved slowly out of the station, pulling the train and Thomas with him. Then he started to go faster and faster, much too fast for Thomas. "Peep, peep! Stop! Stop!" whistled Thomas. "Hurry, hurry, hurry!" laughed Gordon in front. "You can't get away! You can't get away!" giggled the coaches. Poor Thomas was going faster than he had ever gone before. "I shall never be the same again," he thought sadly. "My wheels will be quite worn out." At last, they stopped at a station. Thomas was uncoupled and given a long, long drink.
Well, little Thomas, chuckled Gordon, now you know what hard work means, don't you?
Poor Thomas was too breathless to answer. The next day, Thomas was working in the yard. On a siding by themselves were some strange-looking trucks. "That's the breakdown train," said his driver. "When there's an accident, the workers use it to help clear and mend the line." Just then, James came whistling through the yard crying, "Help! Help!" His brake blocks were on fire, and his trucks were pushing him faster and faster. James disappeared into the distance. Soon after, a bell rang in the signal box, and a man came running. "James is off the line! We need the breakdown train! Quickly!" he shouted. Thomas was coupled onto the breakdown train, and off he went as fast as he could. "Bother those trucks and their tricks," he said. "I hope James isn't hurt." They found James and the trucks at a bend in the line. James was in a field with a cow staring at him. The brake van and the last few trucks were still on the rails, but the front ones were piled in a heap behind James. James's driver and fireman were checking to see if he was hurt. "Don't worry, James," his driver said. "It wasn't your fault. It was those troublesome trucks." Thomas pushed the breakdown train alongside James. Then he pulled the trucks that were still on the line out of the way. "Oh dear," they groaned. Serves you right, puffed Thomas crossly. As soon as the other trucks were back on the line, Thomas pulled them away too. He was hard at work all afternoon. Using 2 cranes, the men put James carefully back on the rails. He tried to move, but he couldn't. So Thomas pulled him back to the shed. The Fat Controller was waiting for them there.
Well, Thomas, he said kindly, I've heard all about it, and I think you're a really useful engine. I'm so pleased with you that I'm going to give you your own branch line.
"Oh, thank you, sir," said Thomas happily. Now Thomas is as content as can be. He has a branch line all to himself, and he puffs proudly backwards and forwards from morning till night, with his coaches Annie and Clarabel. Edward and Henry stop quite often at the junction to talk to him. Gordon is always in a hurry and doesn't stop. But he never forgets to say poop, poop, poop to Thomas, and Thomas always whistles peep, peep, peep in return. James the Red Engine. James was a new engine with a shiny coat of red paint. He had 2 small wheels in front and 6 driving wheels behind. They were smaller than Gordon's, but bigger than Thomas's.
You are a special mixed traffic engine, the Fat Controller told James. That means you can pull either coaches or trucks.
James felt very proud. The Fat Controller told James that today he was to help Edward pull coaches. "You need to be careful with coaches," said Edward. "They don't like getting bumped. If you bump them, they'll get cross." But James was thinking about his shiny red coat and wasn't really listening. James and Edward took the coaches to the platform. A group of boys came over to admire James. "I really am a splendid engine," thought James, and he let out a great whoosh of steam. Everyone jumped, and a shower of water fell on the Fat Controller, soaking his brand new top hat. James thought he had better leave quickly before he got into trouble, so he pulled away from the platform. "Slow down," puffed Edward, who didn't like starting quickly. You're going too fast, grumbled the coaches. When James reached the next station, he shot past the platform. His driver had to back up so the passengers could get off the train. "Sir Topham Hatt won't be pleased when he hears about this," his driver said. James and Edward set off again and started to climb a hill. "It's ever so steep, puffed James. At last they got to the top and pulled into the next station. James was panting so much that he got hiccups and frightened an old lady who dropped all her packages. "Oh dear, the Fat Controller will be even angrier now," thought James. The next morning, the Fat Controller spoke to James very sternly.
If you don't learn to behave better, I shall take away your red coat and paint you blue, he warned. Now run along and fetch your coaches.
James felt cross. A splendid red engine like me shouldn't have to fetch his own coaches, he muttered. I'll show them how to pull coaches, he said to himself, and he set off at top speed. The coaches groaned and protested as they bumped along, but James wouldn't slow down. At last, the coaches had had enough. We're going to stop, they cried, and try as he might, James found himself going slower and slower. The driver halted the train and got out. There's a leak in the pipe, he said. You were bumping the coaches hard enough to make a leak in anything. The guard made all the passengers get out of the train. You, sir, please give me your bootlace, he said to one of them. No, I won't, said the passenger. Well then, we shall just have to stop where we are, said the guard. So the man agreed to give his bootlace to the guard. The guard used the lace to tie a pad of newspapers around the hole to stop the leak. Now James was able to pull the train again. But he knew he was going to be in real trouble with Sir Topham Hatt this time. When James got back, the Fat Controller was very angry with him indeed. For the next few days, James was left alone in the shed in disgrace. He wasn't even allowed to push coaches and trucks in the yard. He felt really sad. Then, one morning, the Fat Controller came to see him. I see you are sorry, he said to James. So I'd like you to pull some trucks for me. Oh, thank you, sir, said James, and he puffed happily away. Here are your tracks, James, said the little engine. Have you got some bootlaces ready? And he chuffed off, laughing rudely. Oh, said the trucks as James backed down on them. We want a proper engine, not a red monster. James paid no attention, but pulled the screeching trucks out of the yard. James started to heave the trucks up the hill, puffing and panting. But halfway up, the last 10 trucks broke away and rolled back down again. James's driver shut off steam. We'll have to go back and get them, he said to James. James backed carefully down the hill to pick up the trucks. Then, with a peep peep, he was off again. I can do it, he puffed. Then, I've done it, he panted as he climbed over the top. When James got back to the station, the Fat Controller was very pleased with him. You've made the most troublesome trucks on the line behave, he said. After that, you deserve to keep your red coat. James was really happy. He knew he was going to enjoy working on the Fat Controller's railway. Cranky the Crane. Thomas and Percy liked working at the docks. So when the Fat Controller told them they'd be working there for 2 weeks, they could hardly wait. But when they arrived at the docks, there was a new crane there called Cranky. Cranky was always moody, and he called Thomas and Percy useless little bugs. The 2 engines were very upset. They told Gordon and James about how rude Cranky had been. To their surprise, James and Gordon backed up Cranky. He's so high up in the air, said James, facing the wind, rain and sunshine, that it's no wonder he looks down and sees you as annoying little bugs. Thomas and Percy hoped Cranky would stop being so mean to them. The next day, Cranky played a trick on Thomas. He told him to move the cars to the outer track. Thomas was surprised, but he did as he was told. When the Fat Controller arrived, Cranky said,
I asked Thomas to put those cars on the inner track, but he has put them on the outer track, where I can't reach them. And Percy won't do as he's told either.
The Fat Controller was furious. He sent the engines back to the station in disgrace. Thomas and Percy were shocked. Cranky was making it all up. A storm raged across the Island of Sodor that night. At the Fat Controller's station, Thomas and Percy talked about Cranky. They were upset that the Fat Controller had believed his lies. They wondered if they'd ever be allowed to work at the docks again. If Cranky is going to continue being nasty to us, then I don't want to work at the docks anyway, Thomas said. Percy had to agree. At the docks, the wind and rain were lashing down on Cranky. He wasn't worried, though. He thought he was much stronger than any storm. In the shed nearby, Duck, James and Gordon were listening to the storm. They thought that they were safe there. But they were wrong. A huge steamer had gotten loose, and it was heading straight for the docks. The steamer ran aground. It charged through the docks, crashing into the shed and knocking Cranky over. Duck, Gordon and James were trapped. They called to Cranky for help, but Cranky had fallen onto his side, so he needed help himself. Cranky and the engines had to wait for the storm to clear before they could be rescued. The next morning, the Fat Controller went to the docks. Thomas and Percy are coming to help you, Cranky, he said. They'll have you up again in no time. Oh, thank you, said Cranky. Can you tell them I'm sorry that I was so mean to them? So it was you that was causing all the trouble, said the Fat Controller. It seems I owe those engines an apology. Thomas and Percy's drivers tied ropes to Cranky and attached them to the engines. Thomas and Percy quickly pulled Cranky back upright. Cranky was very glad to see the world the right way up again. He got straight to work, clearing away the rubble. Cranky moved the steamer back into the water, and it was carefully tied in place. Then it was safe for him to pull the heavy rubble away from the shed, so the trapped engines could get out. Duck, Gordon and James were very grateful. They had not liked being stuck in the shed. They thanked Cranky for his help. Cranky told them Thomas and Percy had rescued him first.
I never thought I'd be rescued by a couple of...
Cranky was about to say bugs, but he stopped himself just in time. He continued.
I never thought that I would be saved by a couple of small engines. I'll try not to be rude to you again.
Thomas and Percy smiled. They were just about to reply when Cranky said,
Now move out of the way, you mites. I need to get to those trucks.
Purr, said Percy. Cranky wasn't polite for long. He's back to bugging us. Percy quickly moved up the track to get out of Cranky's way. But he had forgotten that his ropes were still attached to Cranky. Wait, cried Thomas, but he was too late. As Percy charged forward, the ropes pulled taut and Cranky crashed back to the ground with a thump. Thomas and Percy had to pull Cranky up for the second time. Cranky felt very silly. Now Cranky works well with Thomas and Percy. He still looks down on them from his high perch in the sky, but he never calls them bugs or mites. After that stormy night, he knows they can be really useful engines. After all, they had rescued him twice. And if Cranky is ever knocked over again, he knows the little engines will quickly put him back in his place. It was a tingly spring morning on the Island of Sodor. Thomas was excited. The Fat Controller had sent him to pick up a new special from Jenny Packard. Miss Jenny ran the yard, where all the diggers, cranes and trucks on Sodor lived. At the yard, Jack was waiting for Thomas. "I'm Jack the front loader," he whirred proudly. "I can load and unload and carry lots of things." "I can haul and shunt," boasted Thomas. Thomas and Jack set off for the quarry. "Is this your first job at the quarry?" called Thomas. "It's my first job on the island," Jack called back. "I can't wait to get to work." At the quarry, the pack was working hard. Jack wanted to say hello to everyone, but they were all too busy to stop and talk. He scooted toward Oliver, the big excavator. "I'm Jack. Can I help?" he asked. "Oh no," Oliver replied. "Help Byron." Byron the bulldozer was shoving rock and rubble with his giant blade. "I'm Jack. Can I help?" asked Jack. "I don't need help," boomed Byron busily. "Try Kelly the Crane." "I'm Jack," Jack whirred, rushing up to Kelly the Crane. "Watch out for my paint," snapped the car. "You should look where you're going." "Isabella," scolded Kelly. "Sorry," said Isabella sourly, "but it's too busy here for rushing and pushing." "The quarry can be dangerous," Kelly told Jack. "Safety first. Why don't you go and help Alfie?" "I'm sorry," said Jack. "I'll try to be more careful." Jack found Alfie the excavator digging a big hole. "I'm Jack," he said. "Can I help you with your work?" Alfie gave him a big smile. "More help means more dirt. More dirt means more fun. I'm Alfie," he replied. Jack and Alfie were soon working hard and having lots of fun. But Jack was worried that the other machines didn't like him. He wished he could really be part of the pack. The next day, Thomas chuffed along the branch line, thinking about his new friend Jack. Thomas couldn't wait to get to the old quarry bridge. He knew the pack was working there. He could see how Jack was doing. "I hope he's settling in," puffed Thomas. At the bridge, Jack and Alfie were loading the dump truck Monty. Dust and dirt were flying everywhere. Work had never been such fun. Jack felt very proud. He had tried hard and been very careful. He hoped the pack would see what a good worker he was, and Miss Jenny would let him stay. Later that day, Ned the steam shovel was moving under the bridge. "I must be careful that my crane arm doesn't hit the bridge," he said to himself. But Ned hadn't lowered his tall crane arm far enough. It knocked loose the important keystones from the top of the bridge. The bridge started to crumble, just as Thomas puffed toward it, unaware of the danger ahead. Jack saw the danger. "Thomas!" he shouted. Jack jumped in and lifted his front loader up to the bridge. He pushed with all his might. Thomas saw the flagman and his driver applied the brakes, but they couldn't stop in time. "Cinders and ashes!" cried Thomas. The stones were very heavy, but Jack didn't let go. Thomas crossed the bridge safely and whooshed to a halt. "Hold on, Jack!" called Kelly, and he rushed to help. But Jack couldn't hold on any longer. The bridge came tumbling down. "Are you all right, Jack?" asked Kelly. "I think so," he replied, but his arms were badly bent. Thomas took Jack back to the yard. Jack was afraid that Miss Jenny would be cross with him. He had jumped in without thinking about safety and damaged his arms. But Miss Jenny was pleased. "Well done, Jack," she said. "You go off to the fitters tomorrow. The pack can't have a front loader with bent arms." "You mean I can stay?" whirred Jack. "You're part of the crew," Miss Jenny grinned. "Welcome to the pack, Jack," shouted Alfie. Kelly and Isabella cheered. Jack was so happy he couldn't think of anything to say. So he just revved his engine and bounced his bucket. Thomas was very pleased that his friend could stay. "Welcome to the pack, Jack," he whistled. "Peep, peep." Donald and Douglas. The Fat Controller's railway was busier than ever. All the engines had to work very hard indeed. "We don't know whether we are coming or going," grumbled Henry. "I know you are working very hard," said the Fat Controller. "So I have arranged for a new engine for freight work to come from Scotland tomorrow." But the next day, the Fat Controller got a surprise. Not one, but 2 engines arrived from Scotland. They were twins called Donald and Douglas, and they had lost their numbers. No one knew which of them was supposed to stay. "One of you will have to go back to Scotland," said the Fat Controller. "I will paint numbers on you for now, but I will decide which is the better engine and send the other one home." So the engines were given new numbers. Donald was number 9 and Douglas was number 10. Donald and Douglas felt miserable. Neither of them wanted to stay without the other. "We'll just have to be so well behaved that he'll want to keep us both," said Douglas. "Aye," said Donald. "He won't be able to choose between us." The twins enjoyed working on the Fat Controller's railway. They were good at keeping the trucks in order, and they soon made friends with the other engines. Every day, Gordon's express train steamed in with a special coach for passengers travelling on Thomas's branch line. Duck had to remember to shunt the special coach for Thomas to pick up. Douglas said to Duck, "Why don't I move the special coach tomorrow?" "That would be very kind, Douglas," said Duck gratefully. The next day, when Gordon arrived with the special coach, Douglas was busy worrying about being sent back to Scotland. "I couldn't abide going back alone," said Douglas to himself. He was so worried that he forgot to take the special coach to Thomas. He pushed it into the siding and went to join Donald. When Thomas came along, he couldn't find his coach. A group of angry passengers complained to the Fat Controller. The Fat Controller went to find Douglas.
I'm very annoyed, Douglas, he said. It looks as though you may be going back to Scotland.
The next day, Douglas was extra careful, and he didn't do anything wrong. But Donald was unlucky. He backed into a siding where the rails were slippery. Poor Donald couldn't stop. He crashed through the buffers into a signal box, leaving the signalman sitting on the coal in the tender.
You clumsy great engine, cried the signalman. You've jammed my points.
The Fat Controller was very annoyed.
I'm disappointed in you, Donald, he said. I was going to send Douglas back and keep you. But now I'm not so sure.
Donald felt very sorry. That night, snow came to the island and covered all the tracks. Most engines hate snow, but Donald and Douglas loved it. They knew just what to do. They puffed busily back and forth, patrolling the line. They even rescued other engines who got stuck in the snowdrifts. All the other engines liked Donald and Douglas. Everyone was sad that one of them was going to be sent away.
They were wonderful in the snow, said Henry.
What we need is a deputation, said Edward. What is a depot station? Asked Henry.
A deputation is when engines tell the Fat Controller that something is wrong
and ask him to put it right, replied Edward.
I propose, said Gordon quickly, that Percy be our desperation.
So it was Percy's job to speak to the Fat Controller. He wished it wasn't. Please, sir, they've made me a disputation, said Percy. To speak to you, sir.
Do you mean a deputation? Asked the Fat Controller.
Yes, sir. It's Donald and Douglas, sir. Please don't send them away, sir. They're nice engines, sir. The Fat Controller smiled. The next day, the Fat Controller went to see Donald and Douglas.
I hear you have been doing good work in the snow. What colour paint would you like?
The twin engines stared at him. Blue, please, sir, they said in surprise. Does this mean we'll both be staying, sir? Asked Donald.
It certainly does, said the Fat Controller.
But the rest of his speech was drowned in a delighted chorus of cheers and whistles. Diesel, the naughty engine. One day, Percy wasn't feeling well. His joints ached and he couldn't breathe properly. The Fat Controller came to inspect him.
You need to go to the works to be repaired, he said. I'll have to get another engine to do your work until you're better.
The Fat Controller phoned other railways to see if anyone could spare an engine. But the only available engine was diesel. The Fat Controller didn't want to use diesel because the last time he had worked at his station, he had caused so much trouble that he had been sent away in disgrace. But as no other engine could help out, diesel would have to do. The next day, Diesel came to the station to pick up the troublesome trucks. Thomas was not happy to see him, because Diesel had played so many tricks on him before. "Take these cars to the harbour," Thomas said, "but don't play any silly tricks," he warned him.
Yes, Thomas, of course I won't play tricks. I'll do whatever I'm told,
Diesel said slyly. The troublesome trucks teased Diesel.
"Yes, Thomas, of course I won't play tricks. I'll do whatever I'm told,"
they said in Diesel's voice. Diesel was angry.
"I'll teach you,"
he roared, and bumped into them roughly, sending them flying into a siding. The troublesome trucks crashed through the buffers and slid off the track. Diesel hadn't meant to make the freight trucks crash. He had only wanted to scare them. But he still wanted them to do as they were told. So he said,
"That will teach you to laugh at me."
The Fat Controller was disappointed with Diesel.
"You will go back to the other railway as soon as I can arrange it," he said sternly. "I won't have trouble on my railway."
After such a severe scolding, Diesel was glad to be going home. A few days later, Daisy was going up a hill when she felt something splash against her wheels. When she stopped at the next station, she felt hot and her joints were stiff.
"You've lost your oil,"
a driver said. "Bertie can take your passengers while we get you repaired." Thomas had to go over the hill where Daisy had spilled her oil. He was halfway up when his wheels started slipping on the oil. Suddenly, Thomas, Annie and Clarabel slipped back down the hill. As they reached the bottom, Clarabel's wheels bounced off the main track onto an unfinished siding. Her front wheels fell off the end of the track and sank into the mud. Thomas was left stranded across the main track. Diesel was at the next station, waiting to go home. He laughed when he heard what had happened, but then he realised that Thomas was blocking the track, so he couldn't get past.
"Bother,"
said Diesel crossly.
"I'll have to help Thomas, or I won't get home."
Workers cleaned the oil off the tracks. Then they put sand on them to help Diesel grip them. Diesel moved slowly forward and was coupled to Thomas. Wooden railway ties were put under Clarabel's wheels so she could be pulled back onto the rails. "Thank you for coming to help, Diesel," said Thomas. "We could have been stuck here all day." Diesel gripped the sanded rails and pulled with all his strength. Slowly and carefully, he pulled Thomas, Annie and Clarabel back onto the main track. "Well done, Diesel," said Thomas. "You have been a really useful engine." Diesel smiled. It felt good to be helpful for a change, instead of always causing trouble. Diesel carefully pulled Thomas, Annie and Clarabel over the slippery hill and into the Fat Controller's station.
"Good work, Diesel," said the Fat Controller. "You've been so helpful today that I would like you to come back to work at my station."
Diesel smiled. He was pleased that he was going home, but he was also glad that he could come back again to work for the Fat Controller. Gordon runs dry. One morning, Gordon's coaches were late. "I shouldn't be kept waiting. The express is the most important train on the island," he moaned. Thomas thought local trains were important too, but Gordon didn't agree. At last, Gordon was coupled to the express and he rushed to the main line. Paxton was pulling stone trucks further along the track. He didn't know that Gordon was hurrying towards him. Suddenly, his signal turned red. As Paxton braked, a stone flew out of his truck and hit Gordon's boiler. "I'm so sorry," Paxton gasped. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Gordon replied. "You can't damage a strong engine like me so easily." "You should get checked for damage, though," warned Paxton. "Nonsense," Gordon replied. "The express must not be late." But Gordon didn't get far before his boiler began to run dry. "That's funny. I thought I had plenty of water," he said to himself. So when he saw a water tower, he asked his driver to fill up his tank. But Gordon didn't get much further before his boiler felt hot and dry again. "I can't stop twice or I'll be late," he worried. "I must keep going. This is the express." Thirsty Gordon tried to ignore the river he passed, but with his boiler running dry, he had to stop at the next water tower. His passengers were cross. The express was meant to be fast, not a slow train. "I'll be fast now," Gordon promised, as he hurried to Wellsworth Station. But as soon as he was back on the main line, his boiler felt dry again. Poor Gordon left a wet trail behind him as he went slower and slower, and finally came to a stop. Thomas followed the wet trail along the track and found Gordon. "I'd run out of steam," Gordon said sadly. "You must have a leak," Thomas told him. Gordon wondered how that had happened. When Paxton arrived, Gordon remembered the accident. "I should have been checked after that stone hit me," Gordon told Paxton, as Thomas saw the hole in his boiler. "Don't worry, Gordon. I'll take your passengers, and Paxton can push you to the steamworks to be fixed." Thomas smiled. Later, Gordon pulled into Knapford Station, blowing steam from his mended boiler. The other engines teased him, but Gordon had learned his lesson. In future, he would always look after his boiler. Harold the Helicopter. Percy was delivering freight trucks of stone to the harbour. At the airfield nearby, there was a helicopter buzzing loudly as it waited to land. "Loud buzzy thing," said Percy to his driver. "I wish it would go and buzz somewhere else." The next day, Percy made the delivery to the airfield. He stopped next to the helicopter. "Hello," said Percy. "My name's Percy. Who are you?" "I'm Harold," said the helicopter. "With my whirling propeller, I can fly like a bird. Don't you wish you had a propeller too?" "No, I like having my wheels on the rails," replied Percy grumpily. "You engines are much too slow," Harold continued. "With my propeller, I can go much faster than any of you." Percy was cross, but before he could reply, Harold flew away. Percy puffed angrily to the quarry to pick up his next load of trucks. "Hello, Percy," said Toby. "You look cross. What's the matter?" Percy told Toby what Harold had said about helicopters being faster than engines. "I'll show him he's wrong," said Percy firmly. As Percy puffed back to the harbour, he heard a familiar buzzing noise ahead of him.
Look, Percy, said his driver. There's Harold. Let's race him. Then he'll see who's the fastest.
Yes, we'll show him wheels are better than those funny whirling arms, said Percy, and he rushed after Harold. Harold heard Percy speeding up behind him. He realised that Percy was racing him to the harbour.
You'll never beat me, he said proudly. I will have landed at the airfield before you can stop at the harbour wharf. Don't listen to him, said Percy's driver. We can win this.
The race was on. Harold thought a little engine pulling heavy trucks full of stone could never beat him. But suddenly he saw that Percy was drawing level with him. A few minutes later, Percy's driver shouted, "We're in the lead, Percy!" Percy was having the time of his life, racing along faster than he had ever gone before. "Beep, beep! Goodbye, Harold!" he shouted as he raced ahead. Harold looked down in surprise. He couldn't believe Percy was beating him. Harold charged after him. Percy's fireman was shoveling coal into the furnace as fast as he could. He wiped a cloth across his hot face.
"Phew," he said. "This is hard work. I hope we do beat Harold."
Then he heard the signal that warned them the harbour wharf was nearby.
"Nearly there," cried Percy's driver. "I hope we've done enough to win."
Percy braked as he approached the wharf. He rolled under the main line and halted at the buffers, puffing loudly. "Did we win?" he said breathlessly. His fireman scrambled onto the cab roof and looked at the airfield. "We've won!" he gasped. "Harold's still looking for a place to land." Percy smiled. He had shown Harold that engines are just as fast as helicopters. Later, Harold looked embarrassed when Percy made the delivery at the airfield. Percy's driver and fireman sang a song. Said Harold Helicopter to our Percy, "You are much too slow, your railway is out of date, and not much use you know, but Percy with his stone cars did the trip in record time, and we beat Harold the Helicopter on our old branch line." Harold smiled at Percy as he flew over him. "You showed me that you can go even faster than me," he said. "I guess wheels are as good as a propeller after all." Percy smiled happily. What fun it had been, racing against Harold. He couldn't wait to get back to the engine shed and tell the others all about it. Meets Cranky. Cranky was having a busy day at the docks. He worked as hard as he could, but still more cargo arrived. Lifting and loading, does it ever stop? He moaned as boxes piled up around him. The fat controller asked Kevin to help Cranky. Kevin was very excited. "I've always wanted to meet Cranky," he smiled. He couldn't wait to show everyone what a really useful crane he was. "Hello, Cranky," said Kevin when he arrived. "I'm here to lend a helping hook. What do you want me to do?" "I don't need any help," Cranky replied. "But surely there's something I can do," Kevin asked. "Stay out of my way," said Cranky. "I don't need any help, thank you very much." Kevin moved to a quiet corner of the docks and waited to be called. "Don't fret, matey. He's Cranky by name and cranky by nature," Salty said kindly. "You'll get used to him. Then, as Cranky unloaded pipes from a ship, some got loose. "Look out!" he yelled as they crashed down onto the docks. "I'll get them," Kevin called as he rushed to help. Kevin stacked up all the pipes as neatly as he could. "There you go, Cranky, all done," he said. But Cranky wasn't happy. "That was your fault," he said. "Watching me all the time. You're making me nervous. Go away and stop interfering." Later, when Cranky was carrying a crate of chickens, it cracked open and they escaped. "Don't worry, all under control," Kevin said, collecting up the chickens. "I told you to stay out of my way," Cranky replied. "All your whizzing around is making me dizzy." Then Kevin heard a crash as Cranky's hook knocked over some barrels, sending one rolling towards the sea. Kevin rushed to stop it. "I've got it," he said as he reached the barrel. But he couldn't stop and fell into the sea. "Help, help," called Kevin. "Crane overboard," Salty shouted. Cranky quickly lowered his hook and carefully lifted Kevin out of the sea. "Well done, matey," smiled Salty. The Fat Controller was furious when he heard what had happened. "I thought I could trust you with this special job, Kevin," he said. "It wasn't his fault, sir, it was mine," Cranky told him. "Kevin was only trying to help. He's been a really useful crane." "It's good to see you getting along so well," said the Fat Controller. "Carry on." "What would you like me to do now?" Kevin asked Cranky. "Let's get the docks looking shipshape," Cranky replied. "OK, boss," Kevin said with a big smile. "You and me, Cranky, what a great team!" Percy the Small Engine. Percy loved playing tricks on the other engines, but these tricks sometimes got him into trouble. One morning he was being very cheeky indeed. "Beep, beep! Hurry up!" he whistled to Gordon. "Your express train's ready." Gordon thought he was late and came puffing out. When he looked around, there was only a train of dirty coal trucks. "Ha ha!" laughed Percy. But Gordon didn't think it was funny at all. Next, it was James's turn. Percy told James to stay in the shed because the Fat Controller was coming to see him. James was a very proud engine and thought the Fat Controller must want him to pull a special train. James was a very proud engine and thought that Sir Topper Hat must want him to pull a special train. He stayed in the shed all day, and nothing his driver could do would make him move. The other engines were very annoyed. They had to do James's work as well as their own. At last, the Fat Controller arrived. He was very cross with James, but he was even more angry with Percy when James explained what had happened. When Percy arrived back at the yard, the Fat Controller was waiting for him. "You shouldn't waste time playing silly tricks, Percy," shouted the Fat Controller. "You should be a useful engine." Later that week, Thomas brought the Sunday school children to the beach. He asked Percy if he could help take them home for him. Percy thought that it sounded like very hard work, but he promised Thomas he would help. The children had a lovely day, but by the afternoon there were dark clouds overhead. Suddenly there was thunder and lightning, and the rain came lashing down.
The children hurried to the station. Annie and Clarabel were waiting for them at the platform. The children scrambled into the warm coaches. "Percy, take the children home quickly, please," ordered the station master. The rain poured down on Percy's boiler. Ugh, he shivered. He thought about pretending that he had broken down, so another engine would have to go instead of him. But then he remembered his promise. He had to make sure the children got home safely. Percy set off bravely, but his driver was worried. The rain was very heavy now, and the river was rising fast. The rain was getting in Percy's eyes, and he couldn't see where he was going. Suddenly, he found himself in deep water. "Oh, my wheels!" shivered Percy, but he struggled on. "Oosh!" he hissed. The rain was beginning to put his foot out. Percy's driver decided to stop the train in a cut. The guard went to find the telephone. He returned very worried. "We couldn't go back if we wanted to," he said. "The bridge near the junction is down." They would have to keep going to the next station. But Percy's fire had nearly gone out, and they needed more wood to keep it going. "We'll have to pull up the floorboards and burn them," said the fireman. Soon they had plenty of wood. Percy's fire burned well, and he felt warm and comfortable again. Suddenly there was a buzz, buzz, buzz. Harold was flying overhead. "Oh dear," thought Percy sadly. "Harold has come to laugh at me." Bump! Something thudded on Percy's boiler. A parachute had landed on top of him. Harold hadn't come to laugh. He was dropping hot drinks for everyone. Everyone had some hot cocoa and felt much better. Percy had gotten some steam up. "Beep, beep! Thank you, Harold!" he whistled. "Come on, let's go!" As Percy started to move, the water began to creep up and up and up. It began to put his fire out again. "Ooh, shh!" shivered Percy. Percy was losing steam, but he bravely kept going. "I promised Thomas," he panted. "I must keep my promise." The fireman piled his fire high with wood. "I must do it," Percy gasped. "I must, I must, I must." Percy made a last great effort and cleared the flood. "Three cheers for Percy!" called the vicar, and the children cheered as loudly as they could. Harold arrived with the Fat Controller. "Harold told me you were splendid, Percy," said the Fat Controller. "He says he can beat you at some things, but not at being a submarine. I don't know what you've both been doing, but I do know that you're a really useful engine." "Oh, thank you, sir," whispered Percy happily. The news of Percy's adventure soon got back to the station. Gordon and James heard all about how Percy had kept his promise and travelled through the terrible storm to bring the children home safely. They both thought he was very brave and forgave him for all his tricks. Percy realised that although playing tricks could be fun, It was much more important to be a really useful engine. Mighty Mac. The island of Sodor is a very busy place in the summertime. People come from far and wide to camp out, sunbathe on the beaches, and go for long walks in the beautiful hills. Thomas and his friends are kept very busy, taking campers from the docks to their campsites. Toot toot! Whistle the engines as they race along the many tracks that cross the island. The engines were so busy that the fat controller asked a new engine to come to the island and help with the summer rush. The new engine's job would be to take campers to the mountain campsite. He had to be a very strong engine because the mountain track was very steep with lots of twists and turns. Thomas was waiting at the transfer yards to welcome the new engine. He whistled a big hello! Hello, came the reply from the engine. It was followed very quickly by another hello. Thomas looked from one end of the engine to the other. It had two faces. Thomas had never seen another engine like it. I'm Mighty, puffed the boiler with a curl on his head. And I'm Mac, puffed the boiler with freckles. Together we are Mighty Mac. They both puffed at once. Mighty Mac, called Mr. Percival, you are to take those campers to their mountain campsite. But how will we get to the campers? Groaned Mighty. They're on the other side of the yard. There were never so many tracks in the shunting yard we used to work in, moaned Mac. Luckily, Thomas was there to help them. It's simple, he whistled. Look where you want to go, then follow the track that will take you there. Mighty Mac looked at the tracks. Mighty began to chuff carefully in one direction. Mac had other ideas. You're going the wrong way, he puffed, trying to pull back along a different track. No, it's this way, chugged Mighty, pushing Mac along another track. Very soon they were going back and forth along the tracks. They even had a ride on the turntable, but they didn't seem to be getting any closer to the campers. We're here! Mighty suddenly whistled. Oh, really? Chuffed Mac. Then why are the passengers over there? Mighty Mac looked across the tracks at the campers, still waiting on the platform. Mighty Mac certainly wasn't a really useful engine. Now you're late, said Mr. Percival angrily. Follow me, puffed Thomas. He showed Mighty Mac how to cross over to the campers. We'll have to work extra hard, chuffed Mighty Mac. We have to get to the campsite before it gets dark. Mighty Mac chugged quickly up the mountain track. This way, puffed Mighty. When they came to a fork in the track, he began to follow the left track. No, this way, called Mac. But Mighty didn't listen. It's this way, puffed Mac crossly, and he pulled and pushed Mighty along another track. Be careful, cried the campers, who were being bumped and bounced inside the coach. Suddenly, Mighty Mac came to a dead end. Mighty and Mac had been too busy arguing to pay attention to where the campsite was. Some rocks had fallen on the track, and Mighty Mac couldn't go any further. This isn't our campsite, said the campers. This is your fault, puffed Mac, giving Mighty a shove. No, it's yours, chugged Mighty, shoving him back. Little by little, Mighty Mac shoving and pushing began to nudge the coach, until they were bumping so quickly they knocked the coach off the rails. We'll never get to the campsite now, grumbled the campers. This is your fault, Mighty told Mac. "No, it's your fault." Mac was sure. "1, 2, 3, push!" The campers were working together to get the coach back on the tracks. Mighty Mac watched them helping each other. "OK, you lead this time, Mac," said Mighty. "Let's go down the track so the passengers can couple me to the coach." "Good idea. Let's work together," puffed Mac. "Well done," cheered the campers. When Mighty and Mac worked together, they found they could do anything. Mighty could see the flag flying high above the campsite at the bottom of the mountain. "Let's go," he whistled. "Hold on," said Mac. "Which way is it to the campsite?" "Remember what Thomas told us?" puffed Mighty brightly. "Look where you want to go," puffed Mac. "Then follow the track that will take you there," chuffed Mighty. "You know, Mac," wished Mighty, "when we pull together and work together, we can be a really useful engine," whistled Mac. And they set off happily, back down the mountain. Victor, the shiny red engine. One morning, the Fat Controller had a special new job for Thomas. "You must look after the steamworks while Victor is at the transfer yards," he said cheerfully. Thomas's firebox fizzed with excitement. He loved visiting the steamworks. "Make sure you listen to Victor carefully. He will tell you everything you need to know," the Fat Controller told Thomas. "Yes, sir," Thomas whistled happily as he set off. When Thomas arrived at the steamworks, Victor was waiting for him. Everyone liked Victor because he always knew what to do and kept the steamworks running smoothly. "Hello, my friend," he smiled. "Today is going to be a busy day for you." "I like being busy, Victor," tooted Thomas. He couldn't wait to get started. "Now, Thomas," said Victor firmly, "when an engine comes in, you must listen carefully to their problem. If you get stuck, ask Kevin." A cheerful yellow crane wheeled towards Thomas and Victor. "That's right, Thomas," said Kevin. "Just ask me if you get in a fix." But Thomas was too excited to listen. He just wanted to get on with his very important job. "Don't worry, Victor, I know what to do," he chuffed. "You'd better get going or you'll be late." Victor puffed off towards the transfer yards. Thomas was now in charge. Before long, Spencer steamed into the steamworks. His shiny paint was scratched. "Where's Victor?" Spencer asked. "He's away today. I'm in charge," Thomas replied. "I'll check you from whistle to wheels." Kevin was worried. "Thomas, Spencer only needs a new coat of paint," he said. But Thomas wasn't listening to Kevin. After all, he was in charge. "Put Spencer up on the hoist, Kevin," he said bossily, before puffing away. A few moments later, Henry arrived at the steamworks. He was spluttering and stuttering, wheezing and sneezing. He was surprised to see Thomas instead of Victor. "Victor is away today. I'm in charge," said Thomas. "I know what's wrong. You've been given the wrong coal, Henry." "Oh, no, Thomas. I have my special coal. The problem is..." Henry wheezed. But Thomas wasn't listening. After all, he was in charge. He asked Kevin to fetch Henry's coal. Next, James plugged into the steamboat. His funnel was blocked with straw and twigs.
Where's Victor?
He thought slowly. He's away today. I'm in charge, said Thomas. What you need is a new funnel, James.
Oh, no, Thomas.
James began, but Thomas wasn't listening. He was in charge. Kevin, find a spare funnel, please, he tooted. Thomas looked around the busy steamboat and felt very proud indeed. Poor Kevin wheeled this way and that with worry. He wanted to help, but Thomas had given the little crane too many jobs to do. As Kevin reversed with Henry's coal, he bumped the control panel and sent Spencer shuddering into the air. Heaving hooks, Kevin cried. He dropped the coal in surprise, and black dust flew everywhere. The engines couldn't see a thing. Henry banged into James, and James blew the biggest puff of steam he had ever blown. Soon the gleaming steamworks was covered in soot, twigs and straw. Thomas heard a voice through the dark clouds of dust.
Sizzling Sodor! What has happened to my beautiful steamworks?
Said the voice. It was Victor. He had arrived back early from the transfer yards. Thomas looked at Victor, then at the mess and muddle around them. I'm sorry, Victor. This is all my fault, Thomas said. I didn't listen to Kevin, and I didn't listen to my friends. I was too excited. Now look at the mess I've made. He puffed sadly. Thomas was very sorry.
I think, my friend, you are right, Victor huffed. But if you listen carefully to us now, we can clean the steamworks together.
This time, Thomas did just as his friends told him. First, they took Spencer down from the horse.
I don't need to be checked to whistle the wheels, Thomas. I just need some new paint for my scratches and scars, he said.
Yes, Spencer, smiled Thomas. Soon, with a little help from Victor, Spencer's silver paint was sparkling. Next, Victor and Thomas talked to Henry. I have my special coal, he told them, but my firebox is making me wheeze and sneeze. Now that he knew what the real problem was, Thomas knew just what to do. Don't worry, Henry, Thomas whistled. Your firebox needs a cleaning, that's all. Thomas was right. After Victor and Thomas had helped clean Henry's firebox, Henry felt as good as new. Last of all, Thomas and Victor went to help James. I don't need a new funnel, James said. I just need to have my old funnel cleaned and polished. And before long, James was shining from fender to footplate. Now all the engines were ready to be really useful, and the steamworks was clean. Thomas promised that next time he visited the steamworks, he would listen to what Victor told him. Don't bother Victor. Up in the hills above Sodor, Thomas met Peter, Sam and the Thin Controller. I'm off to meet the Fat Controller today, said the Thin Controller, so I'm putting you in charge for the day, Peter Sam. Peter Sam gasped. Me, sir, he said. Of course. The Thin Controller told Peter Sam that Victor would be coming later that day. Victor was in charge of repairs and was a very important engine. Don't go bothering him before then with little things, said the Thin Controller. Good luck, Peter Sam, said Thomas as he started to chug away. Being in charge is fun. You get to make all the decisions.
Thomas took the thin controller to meet the fat controller. Peter Sam was left in charge. Just then, Rheneas chuffed along.
The handle is creaking and croaking at the halt, he said. You must fetch Victor to mend him.
Peter Sam looked serious.
No, Rheneas, he said firmly. We must not bother Victor with little things. I will fix the handle myself.
At Daisy, the handle was creaking and croaking.
Please fetch Victor, he said. I'm sure I can fix you, said Peter Sam. I think you need more oil.
So Sir Handle's driver added more oil. But Sir Handle creaked more than ever. Just then, Rheneas came along.
Now Skarloey's funnel is broken, he said. Peter Sam, you must fetch Victor. We must not bother Victor, said Peter Sam. I will chuff to Skarloey and fix him myself.
And off he puffed, leaving Sir Handle behind. Skarloey was wheezing with worry.
My funnel is blocked. Please fetch Victor, Skarloey said.
Don't worry, Skarloey. I'm sure I can fix you, said Peter Sam.
He thought hard.
We need to put water down your funnel, he decided.
Skarloey's driver put water down his funnel, but it only made things worse.
All that water has put my firebox out,
cried Skarloey. Peter Sam felt upset. He hadn't made a very good job of being in charge. He puffed along sadly until he came to a stop.
Oh no, I've run out of coal,
he groaned. Rheneas found Peter Sam.
I've run out of coal, said Peter Sam. Fetch Victor.
Rheneas chuckled.
But you said we shouldn't bother Victor.
Just then, Peter Sam remembered what Thomas had told him.
When you are in charge, you get to make all the decisions, Peter Sam said out loud. Rheneas, I've decided we can bother Victor.
Victor managed to fix all the broken engines.
Why didn't you come and get me? Asked Victor.
The thin controller said not to bother you, said Peter Sam.
I don't mind, said Victor. It's my job to fix really useful engines.
Later that day, Thomas brought the thin controller back to the hills.
How was your day in charge, Peter Sam? He asked. No bother at all, replied Peter Sam. Don't you agree, Victor?
I do, replied Victor. It was no bother at all.